when two Bronze Age superpowers clashed in history's first recorded battle. On a spring morning in 1274 BCE, a 25-year-old pharaoh named Rameses rode his golden chariot into what he believed would be an easy victory, and instead found himself surrounded by 2,000 enemy chariots, his army shattered, his bodyguards dying around him, screaming prayers to the sun god as bronze-tipped arrows darkened the Syrian sky. What happened next would be carved into temple walls across Egypt, written into poetry, and spun into the ancient world's most audacious propaganda campaign. A lie so magnificent that it nearly fooled history itself. This is the story of how Rameses the Great almost died in the greatest military disaster of his career, then convinced everyone he'd won the most glorious victory Egypt had ever seen. But here's what makes Kadesh truly revolutionary. For the first time in human history, we can actually fact-check the spin. Thanks to clay tablets discovered in the ruins of the Hittite capital, temple inscriptions that stretch for hundreds of feet, and the recent work of battlefield archaeologists, we can piece together what really happened when two Bronze Age superpowers collided on the banks of the Orontes River. The truth is far more fascinating than the legend, a tale of spies and deception, of one man's desperate courage against impossible odds, and of how even a strategic stalemate could be transformed into eternal glory by the world's first master of public relations. Rameses was 5 years old when his father showed him how to kill a man. Not in practice. Seti I was many things, but he understood the delicate psychology of raising a crown prince. Instead, the lesson came carved in limestone at Karnak, where the new pharaoh was already immortalizing his Syrian campaigns in detailed, visceral relief. Young Rameses would have walked through those halls, holding his father's hand, staring up at images of Seti's chariot trampling the Shasu Bedouin, of foreign kings kneeling with their arms bound, of Egyptian archers sending volleys into panicked Canaanite infantry. This wasn't art, it was curriculum. Every pharaoh's son learned to read hieroglyphs, but Rameses was learning to read war. He was born around 1303 BCE, into a family that had clawed its way to power through military excellence. His grandfather, Rameses I, had been a mere general, a commoner, really, before the childless Horemheb chose him as heir, founding what we now call the 19th dynasty. The family came from the Delta region, from Avaris, the old Hyksos capital, and they never forgot their rough origins or the foreign occupation that had humiliated Egypt centuries before. They were fighters, not philosophers. When Rameses I died after barely 2 years on the throne, his son Seti took the double crown and immediately marched north, determined to restore Egypt's dominance over the Levantine corridor that the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten had let slip away during his sun-worshipping reverie. Seti named his son after his own father, a calculated choice that bound the boy to military greatness before he could walk. And Rameses didn't just bear his grandfather's name. By age 10, he'd been given titles that would make most nobles blush: Captain of the Army, King's Son, and most tellingly, Eldest King's Son. Though he had an older brother who'd mysteriously vanished from the records. Palace politics in the Bronze Age were a blood sport where not everyone survived to adulthood. By 14, Rameses was riding in his own chariot alongside Seti's campaigns into Canaan and Syria. The Egyptian military machine was an elaborate beast, divisions of 5,000 men each, named for the great gods Amun, Re, Ptah, and Seth. Professional soldiers formed the core, but the ranks swelled with Nubian archers, Shurden mercenaries with their distinctive horned helmets, and Libyan auxiliaries. A chariot corps represented the cutting edge of Bronze Age military technology. 2 men, 1 driver, and 1 archer, mounted on a lightweight wooden platform, pulled by 2 horses, bred for speed and trained from birth to charge into the screaming chaos of battle without bolting. Seti was teaching his son the brutal arithmetic of empire. Egypt controlled the most productive agricultural land in the ancient world. The Nile's annual flood deposited rich silt that turned the valley into a breadbasket feeding millions. But Egypt was also geographically isolated, hemmed by deserts that made it nearly impossible to invade, but equally difficult to project power beyond. The Sinai Desert was the gateway, and beyond it lay Canaan, a patchwork of city-states that controlled the trade routes connecting Egypt to the wider world. Lose Canaan, and Egypt became a wealthy prison. Hold Canaan, and the pharaoh could claim to rule an empire. But there was a problem. North of Canaan lay Syria, and Syria had a new master. The campaigns Rameses rode on as a teenager weren't exploration, they were containment. The Hittite Empire, ruled from distant Anatolia, had been expanding south for generations, absorbing the powerful kingdom of Mitanni and turning the Syrian city-states into vassals. Hittite kings didn't rule through Egyptian-style divine authority. They governed through a sophisticated system of treaties and client kings, backed by the most fearsome military in the Near East. Their chariots were heavier than Egypt's, built for shock combat rather than speed. Their infantry carried longer spears, and they had something Egypt didn't: access to iron-working technology, still primitive but promising a future where bronze weapons might become obsolete. Seti understood the threat. His campaigns pushed north, past Megiddo and Yenoam, securing the coastal cities and establishing Egyptian garrisons. But there was a limit to how far he could go. The Syrian interior belonged to the Hittites, and the fortress city of Kadesh, perched strategically on the Orontes River, marked the boundary between empires. Seti fought there, achieving what his inscriptions called a victory, though Kadesh remained firmly in Hittite hands when he rode home. Young Rameses absorbed all of this: the glory of victory inscriptions that papered over strategic stalemates, the importance of loyalty among vassal states, the way power projected through a combination of military force and ceremonial display. He also learned something more personal: that being pharaoh meant being perpetually on stage, performing divinity for an audience that needed to believe their king could speak to gods and command the cosmic order itself. By his late teens, Rameses was already practicing the role. Seti made him co-regent, a living seal of dynastic continuity. The young prince led his own military expeditions into Nubia, the traditional training ground for Egyptian crown princes, where the enemy was fierce enough to provide real combat experience, but not so dangerous that a royal death would trigger a succession crisis. He fought well. The troops loved him. He had his father's height, nearly 6 feet tall, extraordinary for the ancient world, and the charisma that made men believe following him into danger was a privilege rather than a death sentence. When Seti died around 1279 BCE, Rameses II ascended to become the most powerful man in the ancient world at roughly age 24. He inherited an empire at its peak, wealthy, stable, militarily dominant, and stretching from the fourth cataract of the Nile deep into Nubia, all the way north to the borders of Syria. The treasury overflowed with gold from Nubian mines. The granaries held enough wheat to feed millions. The army stood ready, disciplined, and led by generals who'd served his father with distinction. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, because Rameses had spent his entire youth watching his father fight to a stalemate against the Hittites, and he knew what the inscriptions didn't say: that Kadesh still stood unconquered, that Syrian princes played Egypt and Hatti against each other, that the northern frontier remained contested and unstable. Seti had been a great warrior, but he'd accepted limitations. Rameses didn't believe in limitations. He believed in destiny, his own specifically, and he intended to accomplish what his father couldn't. He would break the Hittites. He would take Kadesh. He would expand Egypt's borders farther than any pharaoh since Thutmose III, more than a century before. And he would do it all before he turned 30, cementing his reputation as the greatest pharaoh who'd ever lived. It took him exactly 5 years to prepare. 5 years of diplomacy and intimidation, of ensuring the Nubian frontier stayed quiet, of stockpiling weapons and training new chariot crews, of building alliances with coastal cities and pressuring wavering Syrian princes to remember where their loyalties should lie. And in the spring of 1274 BCE, in the 5th year of his reign, Rameses II assembled the largest army Egypt had ever fielded and marched north into history. He had no idea he was riding toward the worst day of his life. While Rameses was learning to be pharaoh in the gilded courts of Thebes and Memphis, a different kind of king was consolidating power 1,500 miles to the north, in a city the Egyptians didn't even know how to pronounce correctly. Hattusa clung to the Anatolian highlands like a fortress that had grown organically from the living rock. Unlike Egypt's temples of limestone and sandstone rising from flat desert, the Hittite capital sprawled across steep ridges, protected by massive cyclopean walls, some sections 40 feet thick, built from stones so enormous that later Greeks would attribute them to mythical giants. The city had no Nile to feed it, no convenient water highway for transport. Everything about Hattusa announced a harder truth than Egyptian divine kingship. Power here came from holding defensible positions and knowing how to survive when the harvest failed. Muwatalli II took the throne around 1295 BCE, and he inherited an empire that functioned on entirely different principles than Egypt's centralized god-state. The Hittite great king ruled through an intricate web of vassal treaties, each carefully negotiated and recorded on clay tablets in the empire's archives. A vassal king in Syria or Anatolia would swear loyalty, backed by elaborate curses calling down divine punishment for betrayal, and in return received military protection and the right to appeal disputes to Hattusa. It was a system that required constant diplomatic maintenance. Vassal states had to be cultivated, rival claims adjudicated, rebellions crushed quickly before they spread. The Hittite king wasn't a living god. He was something more like a chairman of a very violent board of directors. But don't mistake complexity for weakness. The Hittite military machine was the most sophisticated in the Bronze Age world, built on lessons learned from generations of warfare against enemies on every border. Where Egypt fielded light chariots designed for speed and archery, Hittite chariots were heavier platforms carrying 3 men, driver, shield-bearer, and spearman, designed to smash into enemy formations like ancient tanks. Their infantry fought in deeper formations, trained to hold ground rather than pursue glory. And they'd mastered something Egypt hadn't: combined arms tactics, coordinating chariot charges with infantry advances in ways that could devastate less disciplined armies. The empire Muwatalli inherited stretched from the Aegean coast to the Euphrates, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups, languages, and local kingdoms. His father, Mursili II, had spent decades consolidating this territory, crushing rebellions and repelling invasions from the Kaska tribes to the north. Barbarians who regularly raided Hittite territory and once even sacked Hattusa itself. Muwatalli grew up knowing that empire meant eternal vigilance, that every border was contested, that showing weakness anywhere invited catastrophe everywhere. The Syrian territories were particularly volatile. Cities like Aleppo and Carchemish had been Hittite vassals for generations, but the southern reaches, Amurru, Kadesh, and the coastal cities, existed in a contested zone where both empires competed for influence. Local rulers played a dangerous game, swearing loyalty to whichever power seemed stronger at the moment, switching sides when the balance shifted, always calculating whether tribute to a distant overlord was preferable to being sacked by his army. Kadesh was the lynchpin of the entire system. The city sat on the Orontes River at a crucial junction where multiple trade routes converged. The path from the Mediterranean coast inland toward the Euphrates, the road north toward Aleppo and Hattusa, the southern route toward Egyptian-controlled territory. Control Kadesh, and you controlled the flow of goods, information, and armies through the region. Lose Kadesh, and the entire Syrian network of vassal states might unravel as ambitious princes recalculated their odds. Muwatalli understood this with the clarity of a man whose empire depended on reputation as much as military force. When Seti I had pushed north in the 1290s BCE, raiding as far as Kadesh, the Hittite response had been measured but firm. The Egyptian king could carve whatever victories he wanted on his temple walls. What mattered was that Kadesh remained Hittite, its king loyal to Hattusa, the city's formidable defenses intact. Seti had achieved a tactical draw and claimed strategic victory in his inscriptions, while Muwatalli had achieved actual strategic victory and felt no need to brag about it. But in 1275 BCE, everything changed. The kingdom of Amurru, a crucial coastal territory that controlled access to the Mediterranean ports, switched sides. Its king, Bentashina, had been a Hittite vassal, but he'd watched Seti's campaigns and made a calculation. The new pharaoh, Rameses II, was young, ambitious, and clearly preparing for a major offensive. Perhaps Egyptian protection was more reliable than Hittite promises. Perhaps the tribute would be lighter. Perhaps Bentashina simply miscalculated. The betrayal sent shockwaves through the Hittite vassal system. If Amurru could defect without consequences, other cities would reconsider their loyalties. The entire architecture of Hittite power in Syria, built on the assumption that treaties were binding and rebellion was futile, was suddenly in question. Muwatalli faced a choice: accept the loss and reveal weakness, or respond with overwhelming force and risk open war with Egypt. He chose war. But Muwatalli wasn't Rameses. He didn't need glory. He needed results. The Hittite king began a mobilization that would dwarf anything the empire had attempted before. He called in troops from every corner of his domain. The professional standing army from Anatolia, vassal contingents from 19 allied kingdoms, stretching from the Aegean to Mesopotamia, mercenary warriors from the wild Casca tribes, chariot squadrons from Syria. Ancient sources claim he assembled an army of somewhere between 37,000 and 50,000 men, numbers that probably reflect combined forces over multiple campaigns rather than a single gathering. But even a conservative estimate puts the Hittite army at 20,000 or more, a staggering concentration of Bronze Age military power. Muwatalli also did something unprecedented. He moved his capital. Hattusa was too far north, too distant from the Syrian frontier where the coming war would be fought. He relocated the royal court south to Tarhuntasa, a city much closer to the contested territories, positioning himself to respond quickly to Egyptian movements. It was a decision that revealed both strategic brilliance and the gravity of what was coming. Great kings didn't abandon their traditional capitals lightly. The Hittite intelligence network was already tracking Egyptian preparations. Clay tablets from the Hattusa archives show the empire maintained an extensive espionage system, with informants in vassal courts and merchants who doubled as spies. They would have known about Ramesses' mobilization, about the 4 great divisions marching north, about the pharaoh's obvious intention to reclaim Amurru and push deeper into Hittite Syria. What they couldn't know for certain was whether this was another raid like Seti's, brutal but ultimately limited, or something more ambitious. Muwatalli made his own calculations. Egyptian armies were formidable in open battle, their composite bows outranging most weapons, their chariot archers devastating against less mobile infantry. But Egyptian pharaohs were predictable. They needed quick victories and glorious battles to maintain their divine reputation. They didn't do well with ambiguity or strategic patience. Push them into the wrong tactical situation, and their need for glory could become a fatal weakness. The Hittite king decided to make his stand at Kadesh. The city's position was nearly perfect, protected on one side by the Orontes River, approachable only from the south through relatively narrow terrain, surrounded by countryside where a defending army could position itself advantageously. The city itself had formidable walls and a garrison that could hold for weeks if properly supplied. If the Egyptians wanted Kadesh, they'd have to fight for it on ground Muwatalli chose. But he added one more element: deception. The Hittites would feed the Egyptians false intelligence, convince them the Hittite army was still far away, perhaps not even committed to battle. Let the pharaoh's confidence become overconfidence. Let Egyptian discipline loosen as they anticipated an easy siege rather than a pitched battle. And then, when the moment was perfect, spring the trap with overwhelming force. It was brilliant strategy, patient, calculated, and utterly ruthless. Muwatalli wasn't trying to annihilate the Egyptian army. That would be nearly impossible against a force that could retreat into friendly territory. He was trying to inflict enough of a defeat that Rameses would lose face, that wavering vassal states would recognize Hittite power as decisive, that the frontier would stabilize under terms favorable to Hattusa. He was playing a longer game than the young pharaoh who was marching north, convinced of his own destiny. As spring arrived in 1274 BCE, Muwatalli positioned his forces north and east of Kadesh, hidden from Egyptian scouts by the city itself and the rolling terrain. Supply wagons brought food for weeks. Chariot crews checked their equipment and waited. Infantry companies drilled in their formations. Allied contingents from across the empire gathered under the command of the great king, speaking different languages but united in understanding what was at stake. The Hittite lion was crouched and ready. All he needed now was for the Egyptian falcon to fly within reach. The diplomatic letter that arrived in Thebes sometime in late 1275 BCE was polite, formal, and utterly damning. Bentishina, the king of Amurru, had formally renounced his treaty with the Hittite Empire and placed himself under Egyptian protection. The coastal kingdom, stretching from the mountains of Lebanon to the Mediterranean ports that connected the ancient world, had just declared that it trusted the pharaoh more than the great king of Hatti. For Rameses, it was a diplomatic coup that validated everything he'd been working toward. For Muwatalli, reading his own copy of the news in Hattusa, it was a declaration of war written in the language of treaty politics. But here's what made Amurru's defection so explosive. The kingdom sat directly between Egyptian-controlled Canaan and Hittite Syria. As long as it had been neutral or Hittite-aligned, Egyptian armies pushing north faced a strategic nightmare: hostile territory on their coastal flank, supply lines vulnerable, retreat routes compromised. With Amurru as an ally, suddenly the entire geometry of Near Eastern power shifted. Egyptian armies could march north along the coast, with secure ports for resupply. The road to Syria lay open. Rameses understood he had a narrow window. Vassal states were like weather vanes. They shifted with prevailing winds. If he moved quickly and decisively, other Syrian cities might follow Amurru's lead, cascading defections that would unravel Hittite power south of Aleppo without a single battle. But if he hesitated, if he let Muwatalli respond first, Amurru would be crushed as an example, and the message would echo across every vassal court, from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean. Betraying Hatti was suicide. The pharaoh spent the winter of 1275-1274 BCE preparing the largest military expedition in Egyptian history. This wouldn't be a raid like his father's campaigns, quick strikes followed by withdrawal. This was conquest. The goal was to permanently shift the frontier northward, to reclaim the territories that Egypt had controlled during the empire's glory days under Thutmose III, to make every Syrian prince from Damascus to Carchemish understand that the world had a new dominant power. The logistics alone were staggering. An Egyptian army on campaign needed roughly 3 pounds of grain per soldier per day. Just for the men, not counting horses and pack animals. Moving 20,000 soldiers north meant transporting tons of supplies across hundreds of miles of desert and hostile territory. The army would need to carry enough food to reach Canaan, then rely on allied cities and captured supplies to push further north. Water was the eternal problem. Desert wells could support hundreds of men, perhaps thousands if you controlled multiple sources, but not an entire army. The march had to be timed to the season, routed through territories where water existed, paced so that neither men nor horses collapsed from exhaustion before reaching the battlefield. Rameses organized his forces into 4 divisions of roughly 5,000 men each, named for Egypt's most powerful gods: Amun, Re, Ptah, and Seth. Each division was a self-contained unit with its own chariot squadrons, infantry companies, archers, and supply train. The division of Amun would lead. It always did, named for the king of gods and traditionally commanded by the Pharaoh himself. The professional soldiers formed the corps, men who'd trained together for years, veterans of Nubian campaigns and border skirmishes, comfortable with the brutal rhythm of military life. But professional soldiers were expensive to maintain year-round, so the ranks swelled with conscripts, militia troops serving their mandatory service, young men from provincial towns who'd never seen combat. The chariot corps represented Egypt's elite. Each chariot cost roughly what a skilled craftsman earned in a year: lightweight frames of bent wood, wheels with 6 spokes. The Hittites used 8, adding weight but durability. Leather fittings, specialized harnesses for the 2 horses. The crews trained constantly. Drivers who could maneuver at full gallop while archers behind them fired composite bows that took months to construct and years to master. A good chariot archer could loose arrows while the vehicle bounced over rough ground, compensating for movement, windage, and the slight differences in each bow's draw weight, hitting man-sized targets at 100 yards. But Rameses knew Egyptian chariots had a vulnerability. They were built for speed and archery, hit-and-run tactics, flanking maneuvers, pursuit of broken enemies. The Hittite chariots were different, heavier, slower, carrying 3 men, and designed to crash into enemy formations with the weight of a battering ram. If the battle devolved into close-quarters melee, Egyptian tactical advantages disappeared, so the pharaoh supplemented his native forces with mercenaries. The Shurden were sea raiders from somewhere in the Mediterranean, possibly Sardinia, possibly elsewhere, who fought with distinctive horned helmets and long swords, ferocious in close combat and loyal to whoever paid best. Nubian archers came north from Egypt's southern territories, men who'd grown up hunting with bows and could shoot with accuracy that made them legendary. There were Libyans from the western desert, tribal warriors serving for plunder and the chance to fight under the pharaoh's banner. Building an empire meant hiring the world's warriors and pointing them at your enemies. The army assembled at the fortress of Jaru on Egypt's northeastern frontier, modern Tel Hebua, where the desert gave way to the Sinai. It must have been an awesome sight. 20,000 men, perhaps 3,000 horses, hundreds of chariots, baggage trains stretching for miles, everything needed to sustain a military force operating hundreds of miles from home. The priests performed the necessary rituals, blessing weapons and seeking divine favor. Rameses made offerings to Amun-Re, asking the god to accompany him into battle, to guide his arrows and strengthen his arms. It was theater, but theater that mattered. Soldiers fought better when they believed the gods stood with them. The march north took roughly a month. The army followed the ancient coastal route called the Ways of Horus, a path Egyptian armies had traveled for centuries, dotted with wells and garrison forts built during previous campaigns. Through the Sinai's blistering heat, past the ruins of cities destroyed in earlier wars, along the Mediterranean coast where Canaanite cities opened their gates and offered supplies, some from genuine loyalty, others from simple fear of what 20,000 armed men could do to those who refused. Gaza, Joppa, Megiddo, the ancient cities of Canaan, watched the Egyptian divisions march past. Local kings came out to offer tribute and swear loyalty, performing the elaborate bowing ceremonies that Egyptian protocol demanded, kissing the ground before the pharaoh's chariot. Rameses accepted their submission and kept moving. He wasn't here to pacify Canaan, that was already accomplished. He was heading toward Syria, toward Kadesh, toward the confrontation that would define his reign. As the army pushed north into Amurru territory, the nature of the march changed. This was the frontier now, the contested zone where both empires claimed dominion. Egyptian scouts ranged ahead, watching for Hittite patrols, gathering intelligence about enemy movements. What they reported back seemed promising, no sign of a major Hittite army. Local sources claimed Muwatalli was still in Anatolia, perhaps not even planning to contest Ramesses' advance. Maybe the Hittite king was willing to cede Amurru and Kadesh without a fight, recognizing that Egypt's military superiority made resistance futile. It was exactly what Rameses wanted to hear, which should have made him suspicious. But the pharaoh was 25 years old, leading his first major campaign, and everything was going according to plan. His army was intact, his supplies adequate, his allies supportive. The division of Amun led the march, followed at intervals by Re, then Ptah, then Seth, standard procedure that kept the army from bunching up on the march, but meant the divisions were separated by miles of road, unable to quickly support each other if attacked. By early May 1274 BCE, the Egyptian army had covered nearly 500 miles. They'd left the coastal plain and turned inland, following the Orontes River north toward Kadesh. The city sat roughly 15 miles ahead, close enough that scouts could see its walls, far enough that the army needed another day's march to reach it. The countryside was green with spring growth, the river full from winter rains. It was good ground for an army on the move. Water, forage for horses, open terrain for chariots. Rameses made camp south of a place called the Forest of Labwi, probably a scattered grove of trees rather than a true forest, but enough vegetation to provide cover and shade. The division of Amun settled in, while the other divisions were still strung out on the march behind them. Re was hours away, Ptah and Seth even farther back. The pharaoh's scouts reported that Kadesh appeared to be fortified, but not reinforced. There was no sign of the Hittite army. That night, Egyptian patrols captured 2 Bedouin tribesmen near the camp. The captives claimed to be deserters from the Hittite forces, and they had interesting intelligence to share. Muwatalli was afraid. The great king had heard about the size of Rameses' army and had retreated north toward Aleppo, more than 100 miles away. The Hittites weren't going to fight for Kadesh. The city was there for the taking. It was too perfect. Every piece of information confirmed what Rameses already believed, that his reputation had preceded him, that Hittite courage had failed, that glory awaited just 15 miles up the road. The pharaoh made his decision. He would push forward immediately with the division of Amun, not waiting for the other divisions to close up. Why waste time when the enemy had already fled? They could besiege Kadesh, breach the walls, and have the city secured before the rest of the army even arrived. In the Egyptian camp, soldiers prepared for a quick march at dawn. Officers checked equipment, horses were watered and fed, scouts were sent ahead to mark the route. There was an air of anticipation. This was what they'd marched 500 miles for, and it was going to be easier than expected. The young pharaoh who'd never led a major campaign was about to capture one of the most important cities in Syria without even fighting a real battle. It would be a story worthy of the temple walls. What nobody in the Egyptian camp knew, what the scouts hadn't discovered, what the two deserters certainly hadn't mentioned, was that the Hittite army wasn't in Aleppo. It wasn't retreating. It was hidden just northeast of Kadesh, 20,000 men positioned behind the city's walls and the rolling terrain, waiting with the patience of hunters who'd baited the perfect trap. Muwatalli's scouts watched the Egyptian campfires that night and sent word back. The pharaoh had taken the bait. He was coming with only a quarter of his army, racing ahead of his other divisions, convinced the battle was already won. Everything was proceeding exactly as the Hittite king had planned. At dawn on May 12, 1274 BCE, Rameses II climbed into his chariot, adjusted his crown, and led 5,000 men toward immortality. Behind him, strung out across miles of Syrian countryside, the rest of his army followed, unaware that their pharaoh was about to ride into the greatest military disaster of his life. The storm was about to break. The division of Amun broke camp in the pre-dawn darkness, 5,000 men moving with the practiced efficiency of an army that had been marching together for a month. Horses snorted and stamped, their breath visible in the cool Syrian spring air. Chariot wheels creaked as crews performed final checks, axles greased, leather straps secure, quivers full. Infantry shouldered their weapons and fell into formation, the professional soldiers moving with calm precision while the conscripts tried to match their confidence. Somewhere in the growing light, Rameses stood in his gilded chariot, scanning the northern horizon where Kadesh waited. The pharaoh's personal division was Egypt's finest, named for Amun-Re, king of gods and patron deity of Thebes. It drew its core troops from the professional military establishment, men who'd served for years, who knew their officers, who could hold formation under pressure. The division's standard, carried at the front of the column, showed Amun's sacred ram, a symbol visible for hundreds of yards that told friend and enemy alike. This is where the pharaoh fights. To serve an Amun division was to stand at the center of Egyptian military power, literally marching behind the living god himself. But even the best division was still a Bronze Age army, which meant it moved like a vast, ungainly creature across the landscape. The chariots went first, scouting ahead and protecting the flanks, roughly 500 vehicles with their two-man crews. Behind them came the infantry in multiple companies, spearmen with large shields, archers with their composite bows, sword-bearers for close combat. Then the essential but unglamorous reality of military logistics: baggage carts carrying tents, cooking equipment, spare weapons, medical supplies, grain sacks, water jars. Servants and camp followers trudged alongside. Men who pitched tents, cooked meals, tended horses, treated wounds, all the invisible labor that kept an army functional. A military force was really two armies, the one that fought and the larger one that made fighting possible. Miles behind the division of Amun, the division of Re was breaking its own camp and beginning the day's march. Another 5,000 men, another standard, this one showing the sun disk of Re. Another self-contained military unit with its own commanders and supply train. The divisions marched separately by design. Keep them bunched together and they'd clog the roads, exhaust the water sources, turn any ambush into a catastrophic pileup. Space them out properly, and each division could move efficiently, find its own water, camp in manageable areas. The textbook said divisions should march close enough to support each other in battle, but far enough apart to avoid logistical chaos. The problem was that close enough to support meant different things in theory versus practice. In theory, if Amun division encountered enemy forces, Re division could hear the battle and march to reinforce. In practice, on May 12, 1274 BCE, Re division was at least 2 hours behind Amun, which meant 6 to 8 miles of Syrian countryside separated them. If something went wrong at the front, Re division would need to abandon everything, leave their baggage train, and double-time march toward the sound of fighting. And they'd arrive exhausted, out of formation, potentially just in time to die. Even farther back, the division of Ptah plodded north at its own pace. Named for the creator god of Memphis, it was drawing troops from Lower Egypt and the Delta region, Ramesses' home territory, where his family's power base lay. These weren't necessarily worse soldiers than Amun or Re, but they were farther from the action, more disconnected from whatever was happening at the front. In ancient warfare, information moved at the speed of a running man or a fast horse, which meant the rear divisions often had no idea what the front divisions were experiencing until it was too late to matter. And bringing up the rear, a full day's march behind Ramesses, came the division of Seth. Named for the god of chaos, storms, and the desert, the divine outsider, Seth division was probably heaviest in foreign mercenaries and Nubian auxiliaries. They were the furthest from home, the last to arrive at battle, the division most likely to miss the glory. But they were also insurance. If everything went catastrophically wrong, Seth division might survive to fight another day or cover a retreat. Of course, if you needed Seth division to save you, it probably meant the other 3 divisions were already destroyed. This was the army Ramesses had assembled, 20,000 men in 4 great waves, spread across 20 or more miles of road, moving north like a slow-motion invasion. In terms of pure numbers, it was the largest force Egypt had fielded in generations. In terms of tactical reality, it was 4 separate armies that could only hope they'd never need to fight as one. The march from the forest of Labwi toward Kadesh covered about 15 miles of gradually rising terrain. The Orontes River curved through the landscape to the east, providing water and marking the route. To the west, hills and broken ground made movement difficult. This was chariot country, where flat terrain mattered, where cavalry could maneuver. The road itself was ancient, worn by centuries of trade caravans and previous military campaigns, wide enough for chariots to pass, but narrow enough that the division had to stretch into a long column rather than maintain battle formation. Ramesses' scouts ranged ahead, looking for signs of Hittite forces, checking the approach to Kadesh. They reported back with reassuring news. The road was clear, no enemy in sight. The city visible in the distance with its walls intact, but no massive army camped outside. Everything confirmed what the 2 captured Bedouin had said. Muwatalli had retreated, leaving Kadesh to its fate. The scouts saw what they expected to see, which is the oldest trap in military history. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see from their vantage points south and west of the city, was the rolling terrain northeast of Kadesh, where the Orontes curved and the ground rose enough to hide thousands of men and horses from distant observation. Hittite scouts had spent days studying the approaches, understanding the sight lines, knowing exactly where an army could position itself to remain invisible from the south. Muwatalli's forces were there, waiting with predatory patience, watching the Egyptian column approach like a snake watching an oblivious mouse. By mid-morning, the division of Amun had covered most of the distance. Kadesh rose ahead, its walls imposing even from miles away, the Orontes glinting in the sunlight. Ramesses called a halt and ordered the division to make camp northwest of the city. The timing made sense. It was late morning. The troops had been marching since before dawn. Horses needed rest and water before any assault on the city walls. Better to consolidate. Wait for redivision to catch up, maybe even let Ptah arrive before beginning siege operations. Victory was certain, there was no rush. The camp went up with practiced efficiency. Tents for officers, cooking fires for meals, horse lines staked out near water sources, perimeter guards posted. The division of Amun settled in, probably feeling that peculiar mixture of relief and anticipation that soldiers know. The hard part, the march, was over. And the exciting part, the battle, hadn't started yet. This was the comfortable in-between, where you could rest, eat, maybe tell stories about what you'd do after the city fell. Rameses established his command post, probably an elaborate tent with the royal standard flying above it. Guards posted outside, runners ready to carry messages. Officers reported in. The division was secure. Redivision was maybe 2 hours back. Scouts reported no enemy activity. The pharaoh may have started planning the siege, where to position archers, whether to assault the walls or starve the city out, how to divide the inevitable plunder among his troops. And then, sometime around noon, Egyptian patrols brought in 2 more prisoners. These weren't Bedouin this time. These were Hittite scouts, captured trying to observe the Egyptian positions, and unlike the previous deserters, these men didn't have a convenient story about Muwatalli retreating to Aleppo. Under interrogation, and Bronze Age interrogation was not gentle, they told a very different story. The Hittite army was here, right now. Just northeast of Kadesh, hidden by the terrain, 20,000 men ready for battle. Muwatalli himself was present with the full might of the empire. Professional troops from Anatolia, vassal contingents from 19 allied kingdoms, chariot squadrons that outnumbered anything Egypt had brought. The 2 deserters captured yesterday. They'd been plants, feeding false intelligence, buying time for Muwatalli to position his forces perfectly. And they'd succeeded beyond any reasonable hope. The pharaoh had taken the bait, raced ahead of his army, and was now camped with 5,000 men in range of an enemy force 4 times that size. The interrogation details come from the Egyptian inscriptions themselves, which means they're probably accurate. Rameses had no reason to invent being fooled so completely. The moment of realization must have been horrifying. Every tactical assumption was wrong. The easy victory was actually a death trap. The enemy wasn't fleeing, he was preparing to attack. And 3/4 of the Egyptian army was scattered across miles of road, unable to help. Rameses faced a decision that would define everything that followed. He could order immediate retreat, abandon the camp, pull back toward the division of Re, consolidate before the Hittites could strike. It would be humiliating, but it would be safe. Or he could hold position, assume his camp was defensible, hope that Re division could arrive before the Hittites attacked. Or, and this was the option his pride demanded, he could believe that even outnumbered, the elite division of Amun, with the pharaoh himself commanding, could hold against any enemy. He chose to hold. Messengers galloped south toward Re division, with urgent orders to accelerate their march. Guards around the camp perimeter were reinforced. Officers barked commands, shaking their troops out of their comfortable afternoon and back into battle readiness. Chariot crews scrambled to harness horses. Infantry grabbed weapons and tried to form some kind of defensive line. But armies don't pivot from rest to battle instantaneously, especially when caught by surprise. Men were scattered across the camp, some still eating, others watering horses, equipment not yet fully assembled. The difference between a division on the march, compact, alert, ready, and a division in camp, spread out, relaxed, vulnerable, was the difference between a fist and an open hand. And somewhere northeast of Kadesh, Muwatalli received word that the Egyptian camp was in confusion, that they'd discovered the truth but hadn't retreated, that the moment was perfect. He gave the order his army had been waiting for all morning. 2,000 Hittite chariots began to move. The division of Re was completely unprepared for what came screaming out of the hills. They were marching in column formation, the standard traveling configuration for an army that didn't expect contact, when the Hittite chariots hit them. Not from ahead, which troops might have seen coming, but from the flank, emerging from terrain that scouts had pronounced clear. 2,000 heavy chariots carrying 6,000 men, moving at a gallop, crashing into 5,000 infantry who were strung out across miles of road with their baggage train mixed among the fighting companies. The Egyptian inscriptions describe what happened next with unusual honesty, probably because there was no way to hide it. The foe from Hatti came. They came forth from the southern side, and they charged into the army of Re in its middle as they were marching unaware and not prepared to fight. Unaware, not prepared to fight. These are not words you want describing your army at the moment of contact. A Hittite chariot at full charge was 3/4 of a ton of wood, leather, flesh, and bronze, moving at perhaps 25 miles per hour. Not incredibly fast by modern standards, but in the Bronze Age, faster than anything except a panicked horse. The three-man crews had been drilled endlessly. Driver maintaining formation and speed, shield-bearer protecting against arrows, spearmen ready to thrust downward at infantry who couldn't effectively fight back against the elevated platform. The tactic wasn't subtle, it was physics weaponized. Hit infantry in the flank with massed chariots, and formations shattered like pottery. The Re division tried to respond. Officers shouted orders that probably couldn't be heard over the thunder of hooves and wheels and the screaming of men realizing they were about to die. Some companies attempted to form defensive squares, the textbook response to chariot attack, but you can't form squares when you're in marching column with wagons and pack animals between your units. Archers tried to nock arrows, but archery requires stable footing and time to aim, and the Hittites weren't giving them either. Spearmen faced the wrong direction or found themselves isolated from their units, or simply ran because running seemed more logical than standing still while chariots bore down on them. The division broke. Not everywhere at once. There would have been pockets of resistance, veteran companies that held together, officers dying while trying to rally their men. But the overall cohesion shattered within minutes. Some soldiers fled north, toward where they thought the division of Amun was camped. Others ran south, away from the Hittites, abandoning weapons to move faster. Some tried to reach the river, perhaps thinking they could swim to safety, though the Orontes was fast and deep, and men wearing any kind of armor drowned easily. The baggage train, hundreds of carts and pack animals carrying everything the division needed, was captured or scattered. Servants and camp followers fled into the countryside, or were cut down where they stood. The entire engagement probably lasted less than an hour. The division of Re, 5,000 men who'd been marching confidently toward Kadesh that morning, ceased to exist as a fighting force. Some survivors made it north to warn Rameses. Many more were captured, killed or dispersed into the Syrian hills, where they'd spend days trying to avoid Hittite patrols and find their way back to Egyptian territory. The dead were left where they fell. Bronze Age armies didn't pause to collect their casualties during active combat, but Muwatalli's tactical genius wasn't just in ambushing Re division. It was in what he did next. The Hittite chariots didn't stop to consolidate or celebrate. They didn't pause to loot the Egyptian baggage train or round up prisoners. They kept moving north, driving the fleeing remnants of Re division ahead of them like shepherds, driving panicked sheep. Because those fleeing soldiers were now weapons. They were spreading terror, carrying news of disaster, and most importantly, they were heading directly toward Rameses' camp, where the division of Amun sat completely unprepared for what was about to arrive. Imagine you're an Egyptian soldier in Amun division, camped northwest of Kadesh on a pleasant spring afternoon. You've been told the Hittite army is 100 miles away. Your Pharaoh is with you, which means you're as safe as it's possible to be in a military camp. Maybe you're resting in the shade, or checking your equipment, or eating bread and dried fish, or talking with friends about what you'll do when the city surrenders. And then you see them coming. Not organized soldiers in formation, but hundreds, maybe thousands, of your own troops running. Throwing away weapons and shields to run faster, some wounded, bleeding, screaming about chariots and slaughter. And behind them, still in the distance, but getting closer with terrifying speed, the dust cloud of an army in motion. The division of Re, which was supposed to be hours behind you on the march, has just been destroyed, and the same force that destroyed them is coming for you next. Panic is contagious in military formations. Morale, that intangible quality that keeps men standing in the face of death, depends on confidence in your leadership, trust in your comrades, and belief that your tactical situation is manageable. When soldiers from another division come screaming into your camp with news that everything you've been told is a lie and thousands of enemy chariots are minutes away, morale doesn't gradually decline. It collapses. The Egyptian inscriptions admit what happened with remarkable frankness. They came straight toward the camp of Amun while we were walking, and the army and the charioteers of His Majesty gave way before them. Gave way. The careful language means ran. The elite division of Amun, the pharaoh's personal troops, the finest soldiers Egypt could field, broke and fled before the Hittite chariots even reached them. Not because they were cowards. Courage requires realistic assessment, and what they were assessing was mathematically hopeless. But because the tactical situation was impossible. They were in camp, not in battle formation. The enemy had momentum, surprise, and overwhelming numbers. 3 of their 4 divisions were scattered or destroyed. Staying to fight wasn't bravery, it was suicide. So they ran. North, south, west. Anywhere that wasn't where the Hittites were. Officers lost control of their companies. The elaborate command structure that organized 5,000 men into an effective fighting force dissolved into individuals making individual decisions about survival. The camp was abandoned with everything in it. Tents, supplies, weapons, the baggage of an entire division. Servants and camp followers fled alongside soldiers. Horses broke free from their lines and galloped in terror. The Hittite chariots swept into the abandoned camp and kept going, pushing deeper, exploiting the chaos. This was what they'd trained for, not the initial charge, which was relatively simple, but the sustained pursuit that turned defeat into rout, that kept the enemy running until exhaustion and despair finished what bronze weapons had started. Small groups of Egyptians who tried to make a stand were surrounded and annihilated. Isolated chariots were swarmed. Anyone who stopped running died. Muwatalli had achieved something extraordinary. In the span of perhaps 2 hours, he'd destroyed 1 Egyptian division completely, routed a second, and was in the process of capturing Ramesses' camp with all its supplies and equipment. 3/4 of the Egyptian army was scattered, broken, or too far away to help. The largest military expedition Egypt had launched in generations was disintegrating in real time. But wars aren't decided by pure tactics. They're decided by chaos, by individual decisions made in moments of crisis, by factors that no plan accounts for. And in the center of the collapsing Egyptian position, one decision was about to change everything. Ramesses II, the 25-year-old pharaoh who'd marched north, convinced of his destiny, who'd never commanded in a major battle before, who'd been completely outmaneuvered by his Hittite counterpart, made a choice that was either suicidally brave or divinely inspired, depending on your perspective. He didn't run. The inscriptions tell us he was surrounded by Hittite chariots. 2,500 of them, they claim, which is probably an exaggeration, but conveys the essential truth. He was alone in a sea of enemies. His army had abandoned him. His guards were dead or dying. His generals had fled. Any rational assessment said he should surrender or attempt escape, that staying to fight was pointless, that a pharaoh's death would achieve nothing except making Muwatalli's victory complete. Instead, Rameses grabbed his bow, climbed into his chariot, and charged directly into the Hittite formations. It was the kind of decision that should have resulted in a dead pharaoh and a radically different ancient history. What happened next, whether it was military brilliance, incredible luck, or something the witnesses genuinely believed was divine intervention, would echo through Egyptian culture for the next 3,000 years. But first, Rameses had to survive the next 30 minutes. The killing ground was a 2-mile stretch of road between the forest of Labwi and the Orontes River, and by the time the Hittite chariots finished with it, the dust had turned red. We know from the Egyptian records that Re division was in its middle when the attack came, military language meaning the formation was stretched out in marching column, with the front units perhaps a mile ahead of the rear. This wasn't carelessness. It was standard procedure for an army that thought it was moving through secure territory. But it meant that when the Hittites struck, they hit a formation that couldn't see itself, couldn't coordinate, couldn't even understand what was happening until it was too late. The first Egyptian units to die probably never saw their killers. Hittite chariots emerged from the broken ground to the east, terrain the scouts had checked but not thoroughly, because who expects an entire army to materialize from hills that looked empty an hour ago? The 3-man chariot crews had their roles perfected through endless drilling. The driver controlling 2 horses, moving at full gallop while navigating rough ground and maintaining formation. The shield bearer, protecting the spearman from arrows, and the spearman himself, standing elevated above the infantry, striking downward with a reach advantage that made him nearly invincible against foot soldiers. The physics alone were devastating. A half-ton of chariot hitting human beings at 20 miles per hour doesn't slow down meaningfully. It breaks through, crushing or scattering anyone in its path. The horses were trained for this, bred for aggression rather than flight instinct, wearing decorative armor that made them look even more terrifying. The noise, hooves, wheels, splintering wood, screaming men and animals would have been overwhelming, disorienting, making verbal commands nearly impossible to hear or follow. Egyptian officers tried to respond with what training dictated, form squares, bristle with spears to create zones chariots couldn't penetrate, concentrate archers to shoot the horses. But doctrine requires time and space, and the Hittites weren't providing either. The chariot squadrons hit the column at multiple points simultaneously, not in a single mass charge, but in coordinated waves that prevented any organized response. Where Egyptian units tried to form defensive positions, Hittite chariots swept around them and hit from different angles. Where archers got their bows strung and began shooting, spearmen on the platforms killed them before they could achieve effective volleys. The baggage train became a death trap. Supply wagons and pack animals were interspersed with the fighting companies, standard practice that kept supplies accessible during the march but catastrophic under attack. Oxen, terrified by the chaos, blocked the road. Wagons tipped over or collided. Servants and camp followers who'd been walking alongside the soldiers now ran in every direction, creating additional obstacles. The military formation dissolved into a traffic jam of panicked humans and animals, which made perfect targets for the Hittite spearmen striking from their elevated platforms. Some Egyptian chariot crews managed to get their vehicles moving, trying to fight back with the mobility advantage that usually made Egyptian forces so effective. But Egyptian chariots carried 2 men versus the Hittites' 3, and they were designed for archery, not shock combat. In a shooting match at range, the lighter Egyptian chariots might have prevailed. In close quarters, melee with heavier vehicles designed specifically to ram and crush, they were outmatched. The archaeological record shows us that chariot warfare was extraordinarily violent. Wheel hubs fitted with bronze caps that could break legs, spear thrusts aimed at drivers to disable the vehicles, deliberate ramming that sent men flying or crushed them against overturning chariots. The river became a killing zone of its own. Soldiers who reached the Orontes faced a choice between drowning and Hittite spears. Some tried to swim across, perhaps 200 feet of fast-moving water, while wearing leather armor that became waterlogged and heavy. Others discarded their equipment to swim, making themselves defenseless on the far bank. The Hittite chariots couldn't follow them into the water, but archers could shoot them while they struggled in the current, and pursuit forces waited on the opposite shore. Bodies floated downstream for miles, some eventually washing up near Kadesh, where other Egyptian units would see them and understand what had happened to their comrades. The massacre probably lasted 45 minutes, maybe an hour. Not because the Egyptians put up sustained resistance. There was resistance, absolutely. Pockets of veterans who died fighting rather than running, but because it takes time to kill 5,000 men even when they're not effectively fighting back. The Hittites couldn't be everywhere at once, and some Egyptian soldiers escaped by simply running faster and farther than the chariots could pursue. Others hid in the brush along the riverbank, or in the gullies of the broken ground, staying motionless while the battle swept past them, then fleeing once the immediate danger passed. But Muwatalli wasn't interested in killing every Egyptian soldier personally. He was interested in destroying the division's combat effectiveness and capturing its supplies, both of which he accomplished completely. The Re Division's baggage train, hundreds of wagons carrying tents, food, weapons, gold for paying allied cities, diplomatic gifts, medical supplies, everything needed to sustain 5,000 men in foreign territory, was captured almost intact. That was a strategic windfall, not just denying Egypt the supplies, but gaining them for Hittite use and proving to wavering vassal states that the Egyptian colossus was vincible. More importantly, Muwatalli created a weapon out of the survivors. The soldiers who fled north weren't just running away. They were carrying terror with them, spreading news of the disaster, and they were heading directly toward Ramesses' camp. The Hittite king understood psychological warfare in ways that predated formal military theory by millennia. An army that sees its comrades fleeing in panic starts wondering if it should flee too. Morale collapses spread like disease, faster than any tactical maneuver. The Hittite chariots reformed after breaking Re Division, commanders shouting orders to maintain cohesion, drivers checking their vehicles for damage, horses being briefly rested. They'd won the first phase decisively, but the battle wasn't over. The division of Amun was ahead, still largely intact, and it included the Pharaoh himself, the political prize that would make this victory legendary. Capturing or killing Rameses would shatter Egyptian power in a way that merely defeating his army couldn't match. The Hittite formations began moving north again, driving the remnants of Re Division ahead of them. Some Egyptian soldiers who'd been hiding now tried to flee as the Hittites swept through again, which created a second wave of casualties. The Hittite chariot crews were probably beginning to tire. Combat at that intensity, even when you're winning, exhausts men and horses, but they could smell complete victory. One more push, one more engagement, and the entire Egyptian invasion would be destroyed. Behind them, the ground was littered with evidence of what happens when Bronze Age warfare goes wrong for one side. Broken chariots with shattered wheels and axles. Dead horses, some still tangled in their harnesses. Bodies of Egyptian soldiers, many of them stripped of armor and weapons by Hittite troops who'd paused briefly to loot the fallen. Discarded shields and spears where men had thrown away equipment to run faster. Supply wagons overturned or abandoned. And everywhere, the smell, blood, death, dust, horse sweat, fear. Battlefields have a distinctive odor that soldiers never forget and civilians can't imagine. North of the killing ground, the first survivors stumbled into sight of Rameses' camp. They were running, wild-eyed, some wounded, shouting warnings that probably made no coherent sense to the soldiers of Amun division who heard them, but the meaning was clear enough. Re Division was gone. The Hittites were coming, and the largest military disaster in modern Egyptian history was about to get worse, because the Hittite chariots weren't stopping. They weren't pausing to consolidate their victory, or round up prisoners, or rest their horses. They were accelerating, exploiting the momentum, driving toward Rameses' position with the understanding that confusion and terror were weapons as deadly as bronze. The division of Amun had perhaps 15 minutes to absorb the news, understand the tactical situation, and prepare for impact. It wasn't nearly enough time. The Egyptian inscriptions describe what happened next with unusual specificity, probably because what they witnessed was so catastrophic that inventing a different story wouldn't have been believable. The Hittite chariots came straight toward the camp of Amun, and when they arrived, they didn't slow down. They crashed into the perimeter at multiple points, overwhelming the hasty defenses, killing the guards who tried to stop them, pushing deeper into the camp where thousands of Egyptian soldiers were still trying to understand what was happening. And then, in the moment when everything seemed lost, when the greatest military expedition in Egyptian history was disintegrating into chaos and slaughter, something unexpected occurred. The pharaoh, who should have been fleeing or trying to organize a retreat, instead grabbed his weapons and decided to fight. It was either the bravest or the most foolish decision Rameses would ever make, possibly both. But it was about to become the story that Egypt would tell itself for the next 3,000 years. The prayer came before the arrows. Rameses stood in his chariot, surrounded by a sea of enemy chariots that the Egyptian inscriptions number at 2,500. Almost certainly an exaggeration, but the psychology was real. He was alone in a way that no pharaoh was supposed to be alone. His army had scattered. His bodyguards were dead or dying. The carefully constructed mythology of divine kingship, which promised that the gods would never abandon their representative on earth, was being tested in the most literal way possible. And so he prayed, out loud according to the inscriptions, shouting over the chaos of battle to a god who might or might not be listening. What is this, my father Amun? Has a father indeed forgotten his son? Have I done anything without you? Do I not walk and stand at your word? It's one of the most human moments in ancient Egyptian literature. A 25-year-old who'd been raised to believe he was semi-divine, suddenly confronting mortality and abandonment, bargaining with heaven while Hittite spears were seconds away from ending his life. The prayer continues for several lines, recorded later in what's called the Poem of Pentor, and it's either legitimate desperation or brilliant propaganda crafted afterward. Possibly both. I call to you my father Amun, the inscription has him saying. I am among a host of strangers. All countries are arrayed against me, and I am alone. My numerous troops have deserted me. Not one of my chariotry has stayed to look back at me. I keep calling for them, but none of them heeds my call. The remarkable thing about this prayer isn't just its emotional rawness, it's that Rameses later carved it into temple walls across Egypt. Most kings would have hidden evidence of being abandoned by their troops. Rameses turned it into the setup for his miracle story. I was forsaken by men, therefore what happened next must have been divine intervention. But before the miracle, there was the fighting. Ramesses' chariot carried two men, himself and his driver, a man named Mena who features prominently in the inscriptions because he didn't run. In the chaos of thousands fleeing, with every rational calculation saying the pharaoh was about to die, Mena stayed at the reins. That kind of loyalty under fire is worth noting. He could have abandoned the chariot, disappeared into the fleeing masses, probably survived. Instead, he stayed, which means he either believed in Rameses or believed in the payoff for saving the pharaoh's life. Either way, it kept the chariot mobile. Mobility was everything. A stationary target, even a pharaoh would have been swarmed and killed within minutes. But a moving chariot, driven by someone who knew what he was doing, created different tactical mathematics. Hittite chariots were heavier and slower, built for shock impact, not pursuit. If Rameses could maintain speed, weave through the enemy formations, avoid getting cornered or having his wheels damaged, he might survive long enough for something. He probably didn't know what. Rescue, reinforcement, divine intervention, or just a heroic death worthy of remembrance. The Egyptian inscriptions describe him fighting with bow and arrows first, the standard weapon for chariot warfare. Egyptian composite bows were masterpieces of engineering, strips of wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, curved backward when unstrung, requiring tremendous strength to draw but capable of shooting arrows with enough force to penetrate armor at 100 yards. Rameses would have trained with bows since childhood, shooting from moving chariots until accuracy became instinct. But archery from a chariot requires your driver to maintain steady speed and direction, giving you a stable platform. Mena was dodging through enemy formations, making sudden turns to avoid being rammed, accelerating and decelerating unpredictably. Shooting accurately under those conditions required extraordinary skill. The inscriptions claim Rameses slew them, causing them to fall into the water, which might mean he was shooting Hittite chariot crews, or might mean he was shooting horses, which was often more effective since a disabled horse meant a stopped chariot meant an easy kill for the follow-up forces that didn't exist. At some point, and the inscriptions are vague about exactly when, Rameses apparently exhausted his arrows or found himself too close for bow work and switched to hand weapons. Swords, possibly an axe, the kind of close-quarters fighting that turned chariots into mobile knife fights. This is where the propaganda becomes hardest to separate from reality, because the temple reliefs show Rameses doing things that are physically impossible. Shooting arrows with perfect accuracy while simultaneously wielding a sword, trampling dozens of enemies beneath his chariot wheels, single-handedly slaughtering hundreds of Hittites in elaborate detail. But strip away the exaggeration and something real remains. Rameses fought, he didn't surrender, and he survived longer than anyone had reason to expect. The Hittite forces surrounding him weren't incompetent. They'd just destroyed an entire Egyptian division. If they couldn't immediately kill one pharaoh in a chariot, it suggests either extraordinary skill on Ramesses' part, extraordinary luck, or something about the tactical situation we don't fully understand from the sources. One possibility is that Muwatalli wanted him alive. A captured pharaoh would be worth more than a dead one. The ransom would beggar Egypt. The political humiliation would be total. The propaganda value incalculable. The Hittite chariot crews might have been trying to disable his chariot or kill his horses, rather than killing Rameses directly, which would explain how he survived being surrounded. Ancient warfare had rules about high-value captives, informal but widely understood, and kings generally preferred to ransom enemy royalty rather than kill them. Another possibility is that the Hittites were actually beginning to lose cohesion. They'd been fighting for hours, first destroying Re division, then pursuing survivors, then breaking into Amun's camp. Chariot crews were exhausted, horses were winded, formations that had been tight and coordinated at the battle's start were now spread across square miles of countryside. The units surrounding Rameses might have been isolated from their supporting forces, unsure whether to press the attack or consolidate, vulnerable in ways that weren't immediately obvious. And then, according to the Egyptian sources, the miracle happened. The inscriptions describe it as divine intervention. I found Amun came when I called to him. He gave me his hand, and I rejoiced. He called from behind me as if speaking, "Forward, I am with you, I your father. My hand is with you, and I am worth more than 100,000 men." What actually happened is less poetic but more interesting. Reinforcements arrived. The Egyptian sources call them the Naarin. And here's where military history gets genuinely mysterious, because nobody is entirely certain who these troops were. The word Naarin is grammatically odd. It seems to be a foreign term, possibly Canaanite, possibly referring to young warriors or elite troops. They appear in the inscriptions suddenly, at the climactic moment, numbering perhaps a few thousand men, and they hit the Hittite forces that had been surrounding Rameses with enough impact to change the entire tactical situation. Were they part of Ptah division that had somehow arrived early? Were they Canaanite allies who'd marched separately from the main Egyptian army? Were they a reserve force that Rameses had positioned earlier and the sources simply didn't mention until their dramatic entrance? The inscriptions are frustratingly vague, which might be deliberate. Acknowledging that human reinforcements saved the pharaoh would undermine the miracle narrative that Amun himself intervened. But whoever the Naarin were, their arrival was tactically decisive. Fresh troops, probably in good formation, hitting an enemy that had been fighting for hours and was spread out across the landscape. The Hittite chariots that had been converging on Rameses suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected direction. The momentum that had carried them through two Egyptian divisions abruptly stalled. The temple reliefs at Abu Simbel and Luxor show what happened next with cinematic detail. Egyptian troops counterattacking, Hittite chariots withdrawing, bodies falling into the Orontes River. The inscriptions describe wholesale slaughter. Not one of them looked back, and there was no one who turned around. Each one had fallen on his fellow, and I slew them with none escaping me. The numbers are propaganda. Rameses didn't personally kill thousands of enemies, but the reversal was real. The Hittite forces, which minutes earlier had been on the verge of total victory, were suddenly fighting a two-front engagement against fresh troops while their own forces were tired, spread out, and confused about what was happening. Ancient battles turned on morale as much as tactics, and morale was suddenly swinging wildly in Egypt's favor. Some Hittite chariot crews broke and ran. Others tried to fight their way out of the developing encirclement. The ones closest to Rameses, whether attempting capture or kill, now found themselves most at risk, surrounded by the Naarin and cut off from support. The Egyptian inscriptions claim that senior Hittite commanders died in this phase of the battle, names carefully recorded because killing enemy leaders was worth noting. Princes and generals who'd come within reach of capturing a pharaoh and instead found themselves dying on Syrian soil. Rameses seized the momentum. This was no longer desperate survival. This was counterattack. The reliefs show him pursuing fleeing Hittites, his chariot trampling over enemy wounded, arrows flying, the pharaoh transformed from victim to avenger. It's propaganda, but it's propaganda that had to be at least somewhat believable to the thousands of Egyptian soldiers who'd survived the battle and knew what actually happened. The fighting devolved into smaller engagements scattered across the landscape. Hittite forces trying to withdraw in order versus Egyptian troops trying to exploit the reversal. Chariots dueling at close range. Infantry companies stumbling into each other and fighting brief, vicious skirmishes before breaking apart. The kind of chaotic, fragmented combat that happens when large formations dissolve into small unit actions. And then, as afternoon wore into evening, the division of Ptah finally arrived. 5,000 fresh troops marching onto a battlefield where both sides were exhausted changed everything again. Muwatalli, watching from his command position near Kadesh, suddenly faced very different mathematics. He destroyed one Egyptian division, routed a second, inflicted catastrophic casualties on a third. But he hadn't captured or killed the pharaoh, and now Egyptian reinforcements were arriving with more, probably behind them. His own forces were tired, spread out, some units caught in bad positions, others still scattered across miles pursuing fleeing Egyptians. The Hittite king made a tactical decision that might have saved his army. He withdrew, not in panic, not in rout, but in organized fashion, pulling his forces back toward Kadesh's walls where they could regroup under the fortress's protection. It was the right move. He'd achieved a strategic victory even without the pharaoh's head. But it meant abandoning the chance to finish what he'd started. As darkness fell on May 12th, 1274 BCE, the battlefield fell quiet. Thousands of bodies littered the ground between the Orontes River and the Egyptian camp. Wounded men cried out for water or mercy. Horses wandered riderless. Broken chariots marked where the fighting had been fiercest, and both armies, Egyptian and Hittite, pulled back to count their losses and wonder what the hell had just happened. Rameses was alive. Against all probability, all tactical logic, all reasonable expectation, the pharaoh had survived. His army was battered, but not destroyed. The Hittites held the field, but hadn't achieved decisive victory. And both sides would spend that night understanding that what had seemed like a clear outcome, Egyptian catastrophe or Hittite triumph, had somehow become something more ambiguous. The question now was, what would tomorrow bring? The dust hadn't settled when the first Egyptian soldiers saw them coming from the west. A column of troops, tight formation, weapons ready, moving with the discipline of men who hadn't just spent hours running for their lives. The Naarin appeared like an answer to Ramesses' prayer, arriving at the exact moment when the battle hung suspended between total Egyptian annihilation and some slim possibility of survival. The timing was so perfect, so theatrically precise, that 3,000 years later, scholars are still arguing about whether it was brilliant planning or extraordinary luck. The Egyptian inscriptions treat their arrival as divine intervention, because acknowledging that human reinforcements saved the day would complicate the narrative of Rameses as invincible, warrior king. But the reliefs at Karnak can't hide what actually happened. Fresh troops hitting exhausted Hittite forces from an unexpected direction, transforming a one-sided massacre into a two-front engagement that nobody was prepared for. The name Naarin itself is a puzzle. It's not standard Egyptian military terminology. It appears to be a Semitic word, possibly meaning youths or warriors, the kind of term that suggests these weren't regular Egyptian divisions. Some scholars think they were Canaanite allies, troops from coastal cities in Amurru who joined the Egyptian campaign and were marching separately from the main army. Others argue they were an advance element of Ptah division that had somehow gotten ahead of the main body. A few fringe theories suggest they were mercenaries or even a secret reserve force Rameses had positioned deliberately, though the sources give no hint of such foresight. What we know for certain is that they numbered in the thousands. Not enough to match the entire Hittite army, but enough to matter desperately in the specific tactical situation developing around Rameses. And they were fresh, which in Bronze Age combat might have been worth more than raw numbers. After hours of fighting, even victorious troops are exhausted, arms heavy from wielding weapons, throats raw from shouting, minds dulled by sustained adrenaline. Fresh soldiers have clear heads and full strength, which makes them disproportionately dangerous. The Hittite chariot squadrons that had been converging on Rameses suddenly found themselves under attack from their flank. Not a disorganized mob like the fleeing Egyptians, but formed infantry with spears leveled, archers sending volleys into chariot crews who'd thought the battle was won. The psychological impact was devastating. Hittite commanders had to instantly recalculate everything, shifting from, "We're about to capture the pharaoh," to, "We might be getting surrounded." Ancient battles turned on momentum more than modern warfare does. Once an army believed it was winning, that belief created reality. Troops fought harder, commanders took risks. Casualties were acceptable because victory seemed certain. But reverse that momentum, inject uncertainty about the outcome, and suddenly those same casualties became worrying. The same commanders who'd been aggressive turned cautious. The same soldiers who'd been pursuing glory started thinking about survival. The Naarin hit the Hittites in exactly the right place to create maximum chaos. They weren't trying to defeat the entire Hittite army. That would have been impossible. They were trying to break up the formations threatening Rameses, create enough confusion that the pharaoh could escape or regroup, buy time for other Egyptian forces to arrive. And they succeeded brilliantly, possibly beyond anything they'd planned. Rameses, meanwhile, transformed from desperate survivor to vengeful hunter. The reliefs show this transition in explicit detail. The pharaoh, who'd been surrounded and alone now pursuing fleeing enemies, his chariot trampling Hittite soldiers, his bow sending arrows into retreating chariots. It's propaganda, certainly. No single person decided the battle's outcome, but propaganda that captured something true about how morale shifts change everything in combat. Egyptian soldiers who'd been fleeing minutes earlier saw their pharaoh not just alive, but counterattacking. That mattered psychologically in ways that purely tactical analysis misses. In an era when kings were supposed to be semi-divine, when the cosmic order depended on the pharaoh's invincibility, seeing Rameses fighting successfully was like watching the universe reassert its proper structure. Soldiers who'd been running in panic suddenly remembered they were part of an army, that they had comrades and officers and responsibilities. Some of them stopped fleeing, some turned around, some even rejoined the fight. The Hittite forces were facing a situation their commanders hadn't planned for. They'd expected to destroy isolated Egyptian divisions, capture the pharaoh, and achieve decisive victory before the full Egyptian army could respond. Instead, they were now engaged with multiple Egyptian forces across a wide battlefield, their own formations fragmented by hours of pursuit and combat, facing fresh enemy troops whose numbers and origin weren't clear. Worst of all, they hadn't captured Rameses, which meant the political prize that would have made all the casualties worthwhile remained frustratingly out of reach. Muwatalli was watching from his command position near Kadesh, probably receiving reports from runners and trying to understand a battlefield that was deteriorating from certain victory to dangerous ambiguity. The Hittite king had one critical advantage: the city of Kadesh itself, which provided a rallying point and refuge. If his forces could withdraw to the fortress in good order, they could claim to have won the day. They'd mauled 2 Egyptian divisions and held the strategic objective. But if the withdrawal turned into a rout, if Egyptian forces got between his army and the city, the entire victory could unravel. The next phase of the battle was probably the most brutal. Both sides fighting not for glory, but for position. Hittites trying to extract themselves from bad tactical situations, while Egyptians tried to capitalize on their sudden reprieve. This was where the casualties mounted, not in the dramatic charges and routs, but in the grinding combat between formations that were too close together to disengage cleanly. Chariot warfare at close quarters was extraordinarily violent. Vehicles colliding at speed, wooden frames shattering, crews thrown or crushed, horses going down and creating obstacles that other chariots smashed into. Wheels breaking, axles snapping, crews fighting hand-to-hand on foot after their vehicles were disabled. The archaeological evidence from chariot graves shows injuries consistent with falling from moving vehicles, being trampled, taking spear thrusts from elevated platforms. It was not a clean or quick way to die. The Orontes River became significant again, this time as a Hittite liability. The Egyptian inscriptions gleefully describe enemy soldiers drowning, trying to escape across the river. His Majesty slew them, slaughtering them where they stood. They sprawled before his horses, and His Majesty was alone among them. Not one of his soldiers being with him. Those among them who fell into the water. They went swimming, and His Majesty pursued them. The detail about Hittites drowning is probably accurate. Rivers have killed more soldiers throughout history than we usually acknowledge. Men wearing any kind of armor or equipment don't swim well, especially if they're exhausted and panicking. The Orontes was deep and fast-flowing that time of year. Anyone who went into the water without proper preparation probably drowned, and the Hittites were hardly making careful decisions about river crossings while Egyptian forces were pursuing them. The inscriptions also record something unusual: Hittite nobility drowning. They list names, high-ranking commanders, possibly even princes, men important enough that their deaths were worth documenting. The Prince of Ptah, together with the princes of the countries that were with him. My majesty caused them to fall into the water like crocodiles. They fell upon their faces, one upon another, and I slew whom I wished among them. This is significant because noble captives were usually worth more alive than dead. Their families would pay enormous ransoms. If senior Hittite commanders were drowning, it suggests the tactical situation was bad enough that they chose the river over capture, or that the pursuit was so intense they had no other option. Either way, it indicates genuine desperation on the Hittite side, not the orderly withdrawal that Muwatalli would have preferred. But the Hittites weren't broken. Somewhere around late afternoon, the sources are vague about exact timing, Muwatalli made a decision that showed he still had reserves and willingness to use them. He committed additional forces to cover the withdrawal, fresh troops who hadn't been in the earlier fighting, positioned to create a screen between his retreating chariots and the pursuing Egyptians. The Egyptian inscriptions mention a second Hittite attack, though the details are murky and contradictory. Some scholars think this was Muwatalli's infantry finally arriving at the battlefield. The Hittite army had been primarily chariot forces up to this point, with the foot soldiers probably positioned around Kadesh itself. Others think it was simply a counterattack by Hittite units that had reorganized and were attempting to stabilize the situation. Either way, the battle didn't end with the Naarin's arrival. It continued through the afternoon, with neither side able to achieve decisive advantage. This is where we see the limitations of Bronze Age warfare. Both armies were enormous by ancient standards, perhaps 40,000 men total between them, but communications were primitive, formations were fragile, and exhaustion set in quickly. After a certain point, nobody was really commanding anything. Small units fought their own local battles, made their own tactical decisions, survived or died based on immediate circumstances rather than grand strategy. As the sun began setting, the fighting slowly ground to a halt, not because anyone decided to stop, but because both armies reached the physical limits of what humans and horses can endure. The Hittite forces fell back toward Kadesh's walls in something resembling order. The Egyptians, battered and exhausted themselves, didn't pursue aggressively. The division of Ptah was finally arriving on the battlefield, 5,000 fresh troops, but they were coming onto ground, littered with the dead and wounded from both sides, into a tactical situation nobody fully understood anymore. Rameses pulled his forces back to regroup. He'd survived, which was its own kind of victory, but his army was devastated. The division of Re was effectively destroyed, scattered across miles of countryside with perhaps half its strength killed, captured, or dispersed. The division of Amun had been mauled, its baggage captured, its casualties heavy. Only Ptah and Seth were relatively intact, and Seth was still a day's march away. Both sides faced the same question as darkness fell. What happens tomorrow? Muwatalli held Kadesh and controlled the battlefield. He could claim victory based on the wreckage of Egyptian divisions and the territory he still possessed. But he'd failed to capture or kill Rameses, and the Egyptian army wasn't destroyed. It was wounded, but still dangerous. Continuing the battle meant risking his own army against an enemy that now had reinforcements arriving and was defending rather than attacking. Rameses faced even harder calculations. He'd come to conquer Syria and instead nearly died in the greatest military disaster of his career. His losses were catastrophic, his supply train largely captured, his reputation as divine warrior king seriously damaged among the troops who'd seen him almost killed. But he was alive, and he still had 2 intact divisions plus whatever could be salvaged from Amun and Re. That night, both camps treated their wounded, counted their dead, and tried to understand what had happened. The Egyptian soldiers probably told and retold the story of the Pharaoh's stand, embellishing it slightly with each telling, creating the legend even as the battle's smoke still hung in the air. The Hittite troops were probably angry. They'd been so close to total victory, and somehow it had slipped away. And in the center of the Egyptian camp, Rameses sat with his surviving commanders and made the most important decision of the day. What story would Egypt tell about this battle? Because they could tell the truth, that they'd been ambushed, outmaneuvered, and nearly destroyed. Or they could tell a different truth, that the Pharaoh had faced impossible odds and survived through divine favor, that what looked like defeat was actually proof of the gods' protection, that the enemy had thrown everything at them and failed to break them. Rameses chose the second story, and he would spend the rest of his very long life carving that story into every temple wall in Egypt, turning the worst day of his military career into the foundation myth of his reign as Rameses the Great. But first, he had to survive one more night in hostile territory, surrounded by an enemy army that still outnumbered him, and figure out how to extract what remained of his forces from Syria without admitting that the entire campaign had been a disaster. The Battle of Kadesh wasn't over. It was just entering its strangest phase. The night of May 12th was probably the longest of Rameses' life. His camp was a horror show of Bronze Age warfare's aftermath. Wounded men screamed for water or begged for death. Ancient battlefield medicine was primitive at best, and many injuries that are survivable today were death sentences then. The division physicians moved among the casualties with their limited tools: bronze scalpels for extracting arrows, cautery irons heated in fires to seal wounds, linen bandages, honey and grease as antiseptics, and opium poppy extract for pain. They saved who they could and gave mercy to those beyond saving. The dead were everywhere. Egyptian protocol demanded proper burial rituals. The body needed to be preserved for the afterlife. Organs removed and stored in canopic jars. Prayers recited by priests. But there were too many bodies, too few priests, and they were still in hostile territory. The best they could manage was gathering the fallen, wrapping them in whatever cloth could be spared, and preparing for mass cremations or burial pits. It was spiritually horrifying for men who believed improper burial meant eternal oblivion, but practical necessity trumped religious law. The division of Re essentially didn't exist anymore as a fighting force. Some survivors had made it to Rameses' camp, bringing news of the ambush in fragmented, traumatized pieces. Others were scattered across the Syrian countryside, hiding in brush or gullies, trying to avoid Hittite patrols, hoping to eventually find their way back to friendly territory. Still others were captives in Hittite hands, prisoners who'd be held for ransom if they were valuable enough, or enslaved if they weren't. The division's baggage train, with all its supplies and equipment, was gone. The standard of Re itself, the sacred banner that symbolized the division's identity, might have been captured, which was a spiritual catastrophe beyond mere tactical loss. The division of Amun was battered but functional. They'd broken and fled, which every surviving soldier remembered with shame. But they'd also regrouped. Their casualties were significant, perhaps a quarter of their strength killed or wounded, and their confidence was shaken, but they were still an organized military unit. The baggage train was partially captured, which meant food and supplies were going to be a problem, but weapons and basic equipment remained. More importantly, their commander, the Pharaoh himself, was alive and still giving orders, which mattered enormously for morale. Ptah Division's arrival had been providential. 5,000 fresh troops with full supplies changed the tactical mathematics dramatically. They hadn't fought that day, which meant they were rested, fed, and psychologically intact, ready to fight tomorrow if needed. Their presence also sent a message to the Hittites. The Egyptian army wasn't destroyed, reinforcements were arriving, and continuing the battle meant facing units that weren't exhausted. Seth Division was still a day's march south, perhaps 15 miles away. Messengers had been sent to accelerate their movement, but armies can only move so fast. You can't force march troops all night and expect them to fight effectively the next day. Seth would arrive sometime late on the 13th, which meant Rameses had to survive one more day before his full strength was assembled. The strategic calculation Rameses faced was brutal in its simplicity. He could renew the attack tomorrow, try to besiege Kadesh, invest the city, prove that the Egyptian army wasn't defeated. But besieging a fortified city required time, supplies, and siege equipment, none of which he had anymore. His baggage train was captured or scattered. His troops were exhausted and traumatized. The Hittite army was intact behind walls, with short supply lines to their own territory, able to wait out any siege attempt. Or he could withdraw, pull back to friendly territory in Amurru or Canaan, consolidate what remained of his forces, claim whatever victory could be salvaged from the disaster. But retreat would be seen as defeat, especially by the wavering Syrian princes who were watching to see which superpower deserved their loyalty. If Rameses limped home empty-handed, Amurru might switch sides again, and every other Egyptian vassal in the region would reconsider their allegiances. Across the battlefield, Muwatalli was making his own calculations. The Hittite king had won tactically. He destroyed one Egyptian division, mauled another, held the field, kept Kadesh. But he hadn't achieved decisive strategic victory. The pharaoh was alive, embarrassingly alive, and already turning his survival into a propaganda narrative that Hittite scribes could hear being shouted around the Egyptian campfires. The Hittite casualties weren't insignificant. The inscriptions mentioned specific high-ranking deaths, princes and commanders whose names were important enough to record. Modern estimates suggest the Hittites might have lost 1,000 or more dead, with several thousand wounded. Not catastrophic for an army of 20,000, but not trivial either. Chariot losses were particularly painful. Each vehicle represented substantial investment, and replacing them took time and resources. More importantly, Muwatalli had failed to break Egyptian power in Syria. If he renewed the attack tomorrow, he'd be assaulting a partially fortified Egyptian camp with troops who were as exhausted as the Egyptians. Chariots were less effective against prepared defensive positions, and the Egyptians still had numerical strength, probably 15,000 men once Ptah and Seth were fully assembled versus his own 20,000. The odds weren't terrible, but they weren't overwhelming either, and the Hittites had already learned that the Egyptians fought harder than expected when cornered. Both commanders faced a dilemma that neither could easily solve. Continuing the battle risked turning tactical advantage into strategic disaster, but ending it meant accepting an ambiguous outcome that served nobody's narrative. What probably saved both armies from another day of slaughter was mutual exhaustion and mutual uncertainty. The Hittite troops were tired, many wounded, emotionally drained from a day that had started with certain victory and ended with the pharaoh still alive and defiant. Muwatalli couldn't be entirely sure the Egyptians wouldn't receive more reinforcements. For all he knew, there were additional divisions marching north that his intelligence hadn't detected. Attacking tomorrow meant risk, and the conservative play was to hold Kadesh and declare victory. Rameses similarly couldn't be certain about Hittite strength or intentions. Were there more Hittite forces he hadn't seen yet? Would Muwatalli attack at dawn? Could the Egyptian army survive another engagement in its current state? The unknowns were paralyzing, which made the conservative play, withdraw with dignity intact, more appealing than gambling everything on another day of battle. So they negotiated without actually negotiating. There's no record of formal talks or envoys, but armies communicate through actions. When the Hittites didn't attack at dawn on the 13th, they signaled willingness to let the Egyptians disengage. When the Egyptians didn't attempt to besiege Kadesh, they signaled acceptance of territorial status quo. It was diplomacy conducted through military positions, each side telling the other, "We're willing to end this if you are." The day after the battle, May 13th, was probably spent in the grim administrative work of warfare's aftermath. The Egyptians cremated their dead in massive pyres, the smoke visible for miles. They treated wounded, redistributed equipment from the killed to the living, tried to reorganize scattered units into functional formations. Messengers were sent to Seth Division with updated orders: keep coming, but no need to rush anymore. Scouts watched the Hittite positions around Kadesh but reported no aggressive movements. The Hittites were similarly occupied. They'd captured substantial Egyptian baggage, grain, weapons, tents, equipment, gold that needed to be inventoried and stored. Their own casualties required burial or burning according to Hittite customs. Captured Egyptians had to be guarded and processed, sorted into those valuable enough for ransom versus those who'd be enslaved. The city of Kadesh itself needed reassurance that the siege was over, that the Hittites had prevailed, that loyalty to the empire had been rewarded with protection. By the 14th, Seth Division had arrived, giving Rameses roughly 18,000 troops assembled in one place, the largest Egyptian force on Syrian soil in years. But the moment for decisive action had passed. The Hittites were fortified, the Egyptians were exhausted, and neither side had appetite for another bloodbath. Rameses made his decision. Withdraw to friendly territory, reorganize, declare victory, and get out before the strategic situation deteriorated further. The Egyptian army began pulling back south in stages, probably taking several days to complete the movement. It was organized retreat, not rout, units maintaining formation, scouts watching for Hittite pursuit, rearguards ready to fight if necessary. The Hittites watched them go, but didn't interfere. Attacking a withdrawing army could trigger desperate last-stand fighting that nobody wanted. Better to let them leave, claim the victory, and consolidate control over Syria. By late May 1274 BCE, the Egyptian army was back in friendly Amurru territory. They'd lost perhaps 5,000 men, killed or captured, a quarter of their strength. The division of Re needed complete rebuilding. The divisions of Amun and Ptah were functional, but battered. Seth had never engaged, which meant at least one division was intact for defensive purposes. The campaign that was supposed to conquer Syria and break Hittite power had accomplished neither objective. But Rameses was alive. That single fact, which should have been unremarkable, pharaohs generally survived their battles because they fought from safe positions surrounded by guards, became the foundation for everything that followed, because Rameses hadn't fought safely. He'd been surrounded, abandoned, and had survived anyway through some combination of skill, luck, and timely reinforcement. The soldiers who'd witnessed it couldn't quite explain what they'd seen, which made it easier to accept supernatural explanations. The story that spread through the army and then through Egypt was this: the pharaoh had been abandoned by cowardly troops, faced impossible odds alone, prayed to Amun, and received divine strength that allowed him to slaughter enemies by the hundreds until reinforcements arrived. Was it true? In the way that myths are true, it captured something emotionally accurate about the experience, even if the details were embellished. By the time the army returned to Egypt in early summer, the story had solidified. Rameses had won. The Hittites had been defeated. The pharaoh had personally killed thousands of enemies. The gods had intervened to save their chosen king. Anyone who suggested otherwise, who mentioned that Kadesh remained in Hittite hands, that Ray division had been destroyed, that the campaign had failed strategically, was contradicting divine narrative, which was both politically and religiously dangerous. The temple inscriptions went up fast. At Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, the Ramesses and elsewhere, massive reliefs depicting the Battle of Kadesh were carved into stone. The poem of Pentor was composed, 8 papyrus columns of literary propaganda presenting Rameses as warrior hero and Amun as divine savior. The bulletin text provided a more prosaic account but still emphasized Egyptian victory. Thousands of square feet of temple walls became permanent records of a battle that Egypt had, at best, fought to a draw. The Hittite response was very different: near silence. A few terse administrative records mention the campaign. The archives at Hattusa note that Kadesh remained in Hittite hands, and that several Egyptian vassals stayed loyal to the empire. But there are no great victory inscriptions, no poems celebrating Muwatalli's triumph, no elaborate reliefs showing Hittite chariots trampling Egyptian soldiers. The Hittites had won, but felt no need to brag about it, which is possibly the most revealing detail of all. Because ultimately, Kadesh was a strategic stalemate, wrapped in a propaganda triumph. Muwatalli achieved his military objectives, held Kadesh, bloodied the Egyptian army, demonstrated that Hittite power in Syria was unbreakable. But he didn't break Egyptian will or destroy their capacity to intervene in the region. The frontier remained contested, the vassal states remained uncertain, and the fundamental conflict between empires remained unresolved. Rameses failed to take Kadesh or expand Egyptian territory, but he survived a military disaster that should have destroyed his reign before it truly began. And he successfully reframed catastrophic defeat as divine deliverance, which might be the greatest propaganda achievement in ancient history. Egyptian morale remained intact because soldiers believed the gods stood with their king. Syrian vassals stayed neutral because both superpowers seemed evenly matched. And Rameses himself learned lessons about logistics, intelligence, and overconfidence that would make him a better commander in future campaigns. Neither side could force a decision, which meant the war would continue through other means. Both empires were exhausted, both had bled substantially, and both needed time to rebuild before attempting another trial by combat. What neither side knew in the summer of 1274 BCE was that they'd just fought the last great field battle between Egypt and Hatti. The next 15 years would bring more raids, more diplomatic maneuvering, more border skirmishes, but the two superpowers were slowly realizing what the battlefield at Kadesh had demonstrated. They were too evenly matched to destroy each other, and the attempt was costing both empires more than either could afford. The battle didn't end the conflict, but it marked the beginning of the end, the first step toward a peace neither side knew they needed yet. The first Egyptian soldier to return home and tell the truth about Kadesh probably regretted it. Picture him, a veteran from Re Division who'd survived the ambush, spent weeks hiding in Syrian hills, avoiding Hittite patrols, finally made his way back to his village in the Delta. He sits with his family, exhausted and traumatized, and tells them what actually happened, how the division was caught unprepared, how thousands died screaming, how the Pharaoh's army broke and ran, how they barely escaped with their lives. And then word reaches him that the Pharaoh's official version is different. By the time the army returned to Egypt in summer 1274 BCE, Rameses had already deployed his scribes and sculptors. The first reliefs were going up at Karnak, while soldiers were still limping home. The official account was being recited in temples across Egypt, while veterans were trying to explain to their families why their units no longer existed. And the official account said, "Glorious victory, divine intervention, the Pharaoh personally slaughtering thousands of Hittites, Egypt triumphant." Any soldier who contradicted this wasn't just disagreeing with propaganda, he was contradicting divine truth, questioning the gods themselves, potentially committing blasphemy that could bring cosmic disorder. The smart ones learned to nod along, maybe add their own embellishments about the Pharaoh's heroism, definitely not mention the part about running away while their comrades died. This was propaganda warfare conducted at a scale and sophistication that wouldn't be matched for millennia. Rameses didn't just commission a few inscriptions. He launched a multi-decade, empire-wide information campaign that made Kadesh the defining narrative of his reign. The battle appears on temple walls, from Nubia to the Delta, rendered in such obsessive detail that archaeologists can track the evolution of the story across different sites. The poem of Ptah was the literary centerpiece, 8 columns of poetic text that read like the Bronze Age's answer to the Iliad. It's sophisticated propaganda, emotionally manipulative, narratively compelling, and just grounded enough in truth to be believable. The poem acknowledges that Rameses was surrounded and abandoned by his troops, which thousands of witnesses had seen and couldn't be denied, but reframes it as the setup for divine miracle. The worse the situation, the more impressive the deliverance, the more the gods must favor this particular pharaoh. Not one of my soldiers was there, not one of my chariotry, the poem declares. The gods looked down and saw I was alone. Then my father Amun came when I called to him. He gave me his hand, and I rejoiced. Its brilliant narrative structure, establish hopeless odds, show the hero's faith, delivers supernatural intervention, prove that the protagonist is chosen by destiny. Every propaganda ministry for the next 3,000 years would use variants of this formula. The bulletin text was more prosaic, a quasi-journalistic account that provided tactical details, troop movements, geographic information. It served a different purpose. Where the poem inspired, the bulletin documented. It gave the story factual texture, made it seem historically grounded, provided the kind of specific details that make lies believable. His Majesty proceeded northward, his infantry and chariotry being with him. The bulletin reports matter-of-factly, establishing journalistic tone before getting to the miraculous parts. But the real genius was the visual propaganda. The temple reliefs are extraordinary, hundreds of figures carved in intricate detail, showing the battle unfold across massive stone walls. At Abu Simbel, the Kadesh scenes cover almost 700 square feet. At the Ramesseum, Ramesses' mortuary temple, the battle dominates the entire outer wall. At Luxor and Karnak, visitors couldn't avoid seeing the pharaoh's triumph carved in stone stories tall. These weren't just decorations. They were narrative cinema in stone. The reliefs read like comic strips: Egyptian army marching north, Hittite ambush, chaos in the camp, Rameses surrounded by enemies, divine intervention, Egyptian counterattack, Hittite soldiers drowning in the Orontes, final victory. A illiterate farmer visiting a temple couldn't read hieroglyphs, but he could follow the visual story and understand. Our pharaoh fought impossible odds and won because the gods love Egypt. The images were carefully composed for maximum propaganda impact. Rameses appears larger than anyone else, literally superhuman scale. He's shown in his chariot shooting arrows while simultaneously wielding weapons, trampling heaps of enemy corpses, his horses perfectly composed, while chaos swirls around him. The Hittites are depicted in disarray, chariots overturning, soldiers drowning, commanders fleeing. The Orontes River is filled with bodies and wounded enemies calling for mercy. Some details are remarkably accurate. The reliefs correctly show Hittite chariots as three-man vehicles versus Egypt's two-man design. They identify specific Hittite allied kingdoms. They depict the Kadesh fortress with architectural detail that matches the archaeological remains. This accuracy, mixed with exaggeration, made the propaganda more effective. When observable details were correct, viewers assumed the unverifiable claims were equally truthful. The Egyptian scribes even included lists of enemy commanders killed in battle, names carved in stone for eternity. The wretched chief of Ptah, together with the many countries which were with him. The princes of Aleppo, of Kadesh, of Naarin. Whether all these princes actually died at Kadesh is debatable, but listing names added specificity that made the claims seem documented and historical. The propaganda campaign extended beyond temples. Papyrus copies of the poem circulated among literate Egyptians. We have surviving copies from different periods, showing the text remained popular for centuries. The story was probably taught to scribal students as an example of literary excellence. It became part of Egyptian cultural DNA. the story every Egyptian knew about their greatest pharaoh's greatest victory. But here's what makes the propaganda truly remarkable. It worked. Not just in Egypt, where dissent was dangerous, but throughout the ancient Near East, where Ramesses' spin shouldn't have mattered. Syrian princes, who knew Kadesh, remained in Hittite hands, still treated Egypt as a power to be respected. Vassal states that understood Egypt had been mauled still calculated that Egyptian alliance was valuable. The propaganda created a reality that transcended the tactical facts. Meanwhile, in Hattusa, the Hittite approach to propaganda was minimalist. The Hittite archives mention Kadesh in terse administrative documents, troop deployments, supply records, confirmation that the city remained under imperial control. There's no Hittite equivalent of the poem of Pentor, no massive temple reliefs showing Muwatalli's triumph, no elaborate narrative of divine favor and enemy destruction. The closest thing to victory propaganda is the simple fact recorded in clay. Kadesh stayed Hittite. This wasn't because the Hittites didn't understand propaganda. They maintained sophisticated diplomatic networks and knew how to project power. It was because their political system didn't require it the same way. Hittite kings ruled through treaty networks and military reputation, not claims of divinity. Muwatalli didn't need to prove the gods loved him. He needed to prove his vassals should stay loyal, which the battle had accomplished adequately without poetic embellishment. The Hittite version of events was essentially, Egypt invaded, we fought them, they went home, we still hold the territory. Factually accurate, strategically sufficient, emotionally unsatisfying. No drama, no miracles, no narrative arc, just the practical outcome that mattered for governing an empire. This contrast tells us something important about both civilizations. Egypt was a theocracy where the pharaoh's divine status was central to political legitimacy. Rameses needed the propaganda to maintain the cosmic order his kingship depended on. Hatti was a contractual empire where the king's authority came from military success and treaty obligations. Muwatalli needed results, not stories. But silence has its own propaganda power. By not contesting Ramesses' narrative aggressively, the Hittites allowed Egyptian face-saving while keeping the actual strategic gains. They won the battle and the territory, while letting Egypt claim they'd won the glory. It was sophisticated psychological warfare. Let your enemy declare victory while you keep what you actually wanted. The propaganda war had one unintended consequence. It obscured the truth so effectively that modern scholars spent decades trying to reconstruct what really happened. When archaeologists first found Egyptian accounts, they assumed total Egyptian victory. When they discovered Hittite records showing Kadesh remained unconquered, they assumed Egyptian defeat. Only by comparing both sides' accounts, analyzing the archaeological evidence, and understanding the propaganda motivations could historians piece together the ambiguous truth. Both sides fought to exhaustion, neither achieved decisive victory, and both claimed success because admitting stalemate was politically impossible. Rameses kept adding to his Kadesh propaganda throughout his 66-year reign. Every new temple included battle scenes, every new monument mentioned his triumph over the Hittites. He commissioned multiple copies of the texts, ensuring they'd survive if some were destroyed. By the time he died in 1213 BCE, 61 years after Kadesh, he'd created one of history's most persistent myths. And it almost succeeded in erasing the truth entirely. For 3,000 years, the only version historians knew was Ramesses' version. The pharaoh who'd been ambushed, outmaneuvered, and fought to a draw had successfully convinced history he was an invincible warrior king. The greatest victory of his career wasn't at Kadesh. It was in the propaganda campaign that followed. Only the discovery of the Hittite archives in the early 20th century finally provided the counter-narrative that revealed what actually happened. The clay tablets that survived Hattusa's destruction preserved the mundane truth that Ramesses' stone monuments had tried to bury. Kadesh was a near disaster Egypt barely survived, spun into a triumph so compelling that even now we call him Rameses the Great, partly because of a battle he didn't actually win. That's the ultimate propaganda victory, when the lie becomes so embedded in cultural memory that even after scholars expose the truth, the mythology persists. Rameses understood something that modern spin doctors are still learning. Control the narrative, repeat it endlessly, make it emotionally compelling, and reality becomes whatever story people choose to believe. But propaganda has limits. You can declare victory in temple inscriptions, but you can't carve away the strategic reality that Egypt and Hatti were locked in an exhausting stalemate neither could break. The temples might say Egypt won, but the Syrian frontier remained contested, the vassal states remained unstable, and both empires were bleeding resources they couldn't afford to lose. Somewhere in Hattusa, Muwatalli was reading reports about Egyptian propaganda and probably shrugging. Let Rameses have his temple walls. The Hittite king had Kadesh, had Syria, had the vassal network intact, and knew that reality mattered more than rhetoric. For now, what neither side understood yet was that the propaganda war was actually a prelude to something unprecedented in ancient Near Eastern history. Because in 15 years, exhausted by endless conflict and facing new threats neither could handle alone, Egypt and Hatti would do something that would have seemed impossible in 1274 BCE. They would make peace, real peace, permanent peace, the kind of peace that required both sides to admit that fighting to exhaustion served nobody's interests. But first, they'd need 15 more years of learning that lesson the hard way. The letter arrived in Thebes sometime in 1259 BCE, 15 years after Kadesh, and it changed everything. It was written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the Bronze Age, on a clay tablet that had traveled hundreds of miles from the Hittite court. The sender was Hattusili III, who'd become great king after deposing his nephew in a coup that Rameses had diplomatically ignored. The message was simple, but revolutionary. Let's end this. Not a temporary truce, not a tactical pause, a permanent peace treaty between the two greatest powers in the ancient world, codified in writing, sworn by the gods of both nations, binding on their successors forever. It was the kind of diplomatic proposal that would have been unthinkable 15 years earlier when both empires were convinced they could dominate the Near East through military force. But 15 years of grinding, inconclusive warfare had taught both sides an uncomfortable truth. They couldn't defeat each other. The years after Kadesh had been exhausting for both empires. Rameses had launched additional campaigns into Syria, smaller expeditions, targeted raids, efforts to chip away at Hittite client states. Some succeeded tactically, capturing cities or forcing temporary allegiance switches. None achieved strategic breakthrough. The Hittites responded with their own raids into Egyptian-controlled territory, destabilizing Amurru, pressuring coastal cities, reminding everyone that Hatti's military power remained formidable. It was a cold war punctuated by hot skirmishes, and both sides were bleeding resources they needed elsewhere. Because the world was changing in ways neither empire had anticipated, the Assyrians, traditionally a secondary power in northern Mesopotamia, were becoming aggressive and expansionist under a series of militaristic kings. They were pushing west toward Syria, threatening Hittite vassals, creating a second front that Hattusili couldn't ignore. If Hatti kept fighting Egypt in the south while Assyria pressed from the east, the empire risked strategic collapse. Egypt faced different, but equally serious problems. The Libyan tribes on the western frontier were becoming increasingly aggressive, launching raids into the delta that required military responses. Nubia, traditionally subdued, showed signs of restiveness that demanded attention. The Sea Peoples, mysterious maritime raiders whose origins remain debated, were beginning to appear in Mediterranean waters, disrupting trade and threatening coastal cities. Egypt needed to concentrate forces on these emerging threats, but couldn't while maintaining massive armies in Syria. Both empires were also dealing with succession anxieties. Rameses was in his 40s, with numerous sons from multiple wives, and the question of succession was always potentially destabilizing in ancient monarchies. Hattusili had taken power through a coup, which meant his legitimacy remained somewhat questionable, and he needed stability to consolidate his rule. A permanent peace treaty would benefit both kings domestically, showing their subjects that diplomatic brilliance could achieve what military force couldn't. The negotiations probably took months, maybe years. Both sides had accumulated grievances that needed addressing. Territories claimed by both empires, vassal states that had switched sides, prisoners of war held by each side, economic disputes over trade routes and tribute. The diplomats had to craft a treaty that both kings could sell to their respective power structures as victory rather than compromise. The final treaty was a masterpiece of Bronze Age diplomacy. We have copies from both sides, an Egyptian version carved in stone and a Hittite version on clay tablets, which is extraordinary. Most ancient treaties exist only in one party's records, making it impossible to verify accuracy. The Treaty of Kadesh survives in both languages, from both perspectives, allowing historians to see exactly what both empires agreed to. The treaty established several revolutionary principles. First, mutual non-aggression. The great king, the king of Hatti, shall not trespass into the land of Egypt to take anything therefrom, and vice versa. Simple enough, but it codified something unprecedented. Two superpowers agreeing they wouldn't try to destroy each other. In an era when conquest was considered the natural state of international relations, this was radical. Second, mutual defense. If either empire was attacked by a third party, the other would provide military assistance. This transformed enemies into allies, creating a security architecture that protected both against emerging threats like Assyria. It was sophisticated strategic thinking that recognized the world had become too complex for simple bilateral conflicts. Third, extradition agreements. Rebels or fugitives fleeing from one empire to the other would be returned. This was politically crucial. It prevented either side from harboring dissidents or pretenders who might destabilize the other's government. Both kings had experienced internal challenges and understood the value of mutual support for legitimate authority. Fourth, and this is where the treaty becomes fascinating, divine enforcement. The gods of both pantheons were invoked as witnesses and guarantors. Egyptian deities and Hittite deities together would punish anyone who violated the treaty. This created cosmic stakes for breaking the agreement. You weren't just betraying another king, you were defying divine will itself. In cultures where religion and politics were inseparable, this made the treaty effectively unbreakable. The document lists dozens of gods by name from both traditions. Egyptian gods like Amun-Re, Ptah, and Seth, alongside Hittite deities like the storm god and the sun goddess of Arina. It's a remarkable piece of religious diplomacy, acknowledging both pantheons as legitimate without trying to reconcile their theological differences. The gods don't need to agree, they just need to collectively enforce the peace. The treaty also included remarkably modern legal language about amnesty and fair treatment. Refugees who were extradited shall not have their eyes plucked out, nor their ears, noses, or tongues cut off, nor shall they be lamed, nor executed, nor harmed in their eyes, ears, or tongues. This humanitarian clause suggests both sides understood that enforcement would be difficult if returned refugees were immediately tortured or killed. It was pragmatic mercy. Treat returnees decently so that future extradition requests would be honored. But the real diplomatic masterstroke came after the treaty was signed. Rameses proposed something unprecedented: a marriage alliance. He would marry Hattusili's daughter, making her one of his great royal wives, creating familial bonds between the dynasties that would make future conflict almost unthinkable. This was politically brilliant but culturally shocking. Egyptian pharaohs traditionally married within Egypt, usually their own sisters or close relatives, maintaining the divine bloodline's purity. Foreign marriages were virtually unknown. Egyptian princesses occasionally married foreign kings, but foreign women becoming Egyptian queens was extraordinary. Rameses was breaking centuries of precedent, and he knew it. The Hittite princess, whose Egyptian name was Pharaoh, meaning she who sees Horus, the visible splendor of Ra, traveled to Egypt in 1246 BCE, 13 years after the treaty. Her journey was a massive diplomatic procession. Hundreds of attendants, wagons of gifts and dowry, guards, officials, priests performing rituals at the border. Rameses met her somewhere in the Syrian corridor with appropriate ceremony, and the marriage was celebrated as proof that former enemies could become family. The propaganda around the marriage was as elaborate as the Kadesh battle scenes had been. Temple inscriptions described how the Hittite king begged Rameses to accept his daughter, how generous the pharaoh was to agree, how the princess was overwhelmed by Egyptian magnificence. The Hittites presumably told their own version, emphasizing their princess's honor and the tribute Egypt paid for the privilege. Both sides spun it as victory, because that's what diplomatic face-saving requires. But beneath the propaganda was genuine strategic wisdom. The marriage created personal stakes in the peace. Ramesses' children with Pharaoh would have both Egyptian and Hittite royal blood, creating familial connections that transcended political calculations. Future pharaohs and Hittite kings would be cousins or siblings, making war literally fratricidal. The peace held. For the remaining 33 years of Ramesses' reign, Egypt and Hatti maintained their alliance. They exchanged diplomatic correspondence, hundreds of letters discussing trade, extradition cases, medical knowledge. Rameses apparently requested Hittite physicians for various ailments, even weather reports and personal news. The kings wrote to each other not as enemies but as brothers, using familial language that signaled genuine relationship rather than mere diplomatic courtesy. The alliance proved its value when Assyria pushed west into Hittite territory in the 1230s BCE. Egypt didn't send large-scale military assistance. They were dealing with their own problems, including the first wave of Sea People's invasions. But the diplomatic support and implicit threat of Egyptian intervention helped Hatti maintain its boundaries. The treaty functioned as deterrence. Attacking either empire meant potentially fighting both. The economic benefits were substantial. Trade routes opened that had been disrupted by decades of warfare. Egyptian grain flowed north, Hittite metals and manufactured goods flowed south. Merchants could travel without fear of being caught in military campaigns. Cities that had been repeatedly sacked and changed hands now experienced sustained peace for the first time in generations. The economic growth from ending the war probably enriched both empires more than any victory could have. The Treaty of Kadesh represents something historically unprecedented. This wasn't a temporary truce or a victor's imposed peace. It was a negotiated settlement between equals that recognized neither side could dominate the other. It established principles that would influence international law for millennia. Written agreements, mutual defense pacts, extradition treaties, humanitarian protections, divine enforcement mechanisms. A copy of the treaty now hangs in the United Nations building in New York, a bronze plaque near the Security Council chamber, translated into multiple languages, recognized as humanity's first recorded peace treaty. It's an artifact from 1259 BCE that still resonates in the 21st century because it addressed problems that remain current. How do rival powers coexist? How do you make peace lasting? How do you transform enemies into allies? The irony is that this diplomatic triumph, far more important than the Battle of Kadesh itself, receives far less attention. Rameses covered temple walls with images of the battle, but treated the peace treaty as just another administrative document. The propaganda value of glorious combat outweighed the actual historical significance of diplomatic innovation. But here's what the treaty revealed. Kadesh hadn't been the decisive victory Rameses claimed. If Egypt had truly dominated the Hittites, there would have been no need for an equal peace treaty 15 years later. The treaty was implicit admission that the battle's outcome had been ambiguous enough that neither side could claim superiority. The peace was built on the reality that Kadesh had hidden two empires too evenly matched to destroy each other, finally accepting that cooperation served both better than endless conflict. The treaty also revealed something about Rameses himself. He could have continued the war indefinitely, launched more campaigns, kept trying to achieve the decisive victory that had eluded him at Kadesh. Many kings in his position would have. Pride and propaganda had committed him to military dominance, and admitting limitations would have undermined his carefully constructed image. But Rameses was pragmatic beneath the propaganda. He recognized that real strength sometimes means knowing when to stop fighting. The peace lasted until both empires collapsed in the catastrophic Bronze Age collapse that began around 1200 BCE. The Sea People's invasions, climate disruption, economic system failure, and cascading state failures destroyed the Hittite Empire completely. Hattusa was burned and abandoned, never to be reoccupied. Egypt survived but drastically weakened, losing its imperial territories and retreating to defend the Nile Valley itself. But during those final decades before everything fell apart, the Treaty of Kadesh provided stability that made the Bronze Age's last years more prosperous and peaceful than they might have been. Two superpowers that had spent decades bleeding each other spent their final generation as allies, trading partners, and family. When the world collapsed, at least they didn't collapse fighting each other. Rameses died in 1213 BCE, aged roughly 90, having reigned 66 years. One of the longest reigns in history. He'd outlived 12 of his sons and was succeeded by his 13th son, Ptah, who was already in his 60s. The peace with Hatti was so established by then that it simply continued. Ptah maintained the alliance, corresponded with Hittite kings, even sent grain to Hatti during a famine. The treaty had become institutional, surviving beyond the personalities who created it. The final proof of the treaty's success is this. When the Bronze Age collapsed and the Hittite Empire vanished from history, Egypt didn't try to conquer the ruins. They could have. Hatti was weak, fragmenting, vulnerable. But the peace had been so successful, the relationship so normalized, that Egypt apparently didn't even consider exploiting Hittite collapse. They'd become genuinely friendly nations, or at least as friendly as ancient superpowers could be. The Treaty of Kadesh stands as proof that sometimes the most important victories happen not on battlefields, but in negotiating rooms. Rameses won greater glory from propaganda about Kadesh than from the battle itself, but he created more lasting value from the peace treaty than from either. The battle made him famous for 3 millennia. The treaty made the ancient world more stable for 40 years. History remembers the warriors, but sometimes the diplomats actually win. The last person who remembered the Battle of Kadesh firsthand probably died around 1200 BCE, roughly 75 years after the fighting. Perhaps it was an elderly Egyptian soldier who'd been young during the campaign, who'd survived the chaos and spent a lifetime telling stories that nobody quite believed. Or maybe a Hittite veteran, old and scarred, who'd seen the pharaoh surrounded and still couldn't quite explain how he'd escaped. Either way, with their deaths, living memory of May 12th, 1274, BCE vanished from human consciousness. But the battle's echoes were just beginning. Within Egypt, Kadesh became foundational mythology. Ramesses' successors couldn't ignore the massive temple reliefs covering walls from Nubia to the Delta. Every pharaoh who walked through Karnak saw their predecessor's triumph, carved in stone stories tall. Every priest who recited temple liturgies included references to Ramesses' divine deliverance. The battle entered Egyptian cultural DNA as the moment when the gods proved their favor for Egypt's greatest king. The military lessons were absorbed by Egyptian commanders who studied the temple inscriptions like tactical manuals, though the lessons they drew were probably not the ones Rameses intended. Smart generals looked at the Kadesh reliefs and learned what not to do. Don't outrun your supply lines, don't trust intelligence without verification, don't let divisions get separated by hours of march. The battle became a cautionary tale, disguised as triumph, teaching through negative example while officially celebrating victory. The propaganda techniques Rameses pioneered at Kadesh became standard for Egyptian kingship. Every subsequent pharaoh who faced military challenges, and there were many in Egypt's declining centuries, referenced Ramesses' example. They commissioned their own battle reliefs, wrote their own victory poems, invoked divine intervention to explain their survival. Ramesses II had shown how to transform ambiguous outcomes into unquestionable triumphs, and his descendants followed the template even when their actual achievements were far less impressive. But the most important legacy was something Rameses himself probably didn't anticipate. Kadesh proved that Bronze Age empires had reached their operational limits. The logistics of moving 20,000 men hundreds of miles into hostile territory, supplying them, coordinating multiple divisions, maintaining communications. It was barely possible even with the resources of Egypt's empire. The Hittites had similar constraints operating in Syria. Both superpowers had stretched to their maximum extent, and neither could stretch further without breaking. This realization, that conquest had limits, that empires couldn't expand indefinitely, helped explain why the Treaty of Kadesh worked. It wasn't just diplomatic brilliance or war exhaustion, it was recognition that the Bronze Age world had reached a kind of equilibrium where the costs of empire exceeded the benefits of expansion. The treaty codified what Kadesh had demonstrated. Neither side could win decisively, so peace was the only logical outcome. The battle also marked a turning point in military history that wouldn't be fully recognized for centuries. It was probably the largest chariot battle ever fought. The massed chariot charges at Kadesh, thousands of vehicles engaging across miles of terrain, represented the pinnacle of Bronze Age military technology. Chariots would remain important for centuries, but never again would they dominate warfare so completely. Iron weapons and new infantry tactics were already emerging that would eventually make chariot warfare obsolete. When the Bronze Age collapsed beginning around 1200 BCE, much of what had made Kadesh possible disappeared. The economic networks that supported professional armies fragmented. The trade routes that supplied bronze for weapons broke down. The palace bureaucracies that could organize 20,000-man expeditions vanished. The world that emerged from the collapse, what historians call the Iron Age, fought smaller wars with different tactics. The age of massive chariot battles was over. Kadesh was forgotten by the wider world during this collapse. The Hittite Empire vanished so completely that for nearly 3,000 years, scholars weren't entirely certain it had existed. References in the Bible to Hittites were thought to describe minor tribal groups, not a superpower that had challenged Egypt. The battle that both empires had considered pivotal simply disappeared from historical memory outside Egypt. Egypt itself entered long decline. Rameses II's successors faced invasions by the Sea Peoples, Libyan tribes, and eventually Assyrians. The new kingdom that had seemed so powerful in 1274 BCE was gone by 1070 BCE, Egypt fragmenting into competing kingdoms and foreign-ruled territories. The great temples where Kadesh was commemorated fell into ruin, covered by sand, their inscriptions unreadable. For more than 2 millennia, nobody knew the Battle of Kadesh had happened. Greek historians who wrote about Egypt never mentioned it. By their time, the New Kingdom was ancient history, and its records were inaccessible. Roman tourists who visited Egypt's ruins saw the battle reliefs but couldn't read hieroglyphics, so the images remained mysterious. Medieval scholars who studied ancient warfare had no idea this battle existed. It had vanished from human knowledge as completely as if it had never occurred. The rediscovery began with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. French scholars accompanying the military expedition documented Egypt's monuments systematically for the first time in modern history. They saw the massive battle reliefs at Abu Simbel, Luxor, Karnak, the Ramesses, hundreds of square feet of carved stone depicting warfare, but they couldn't fully understand what they were seeing because hieroglyphics remained undeciphered. Jean-François Champollion's breakthrough in decoding hieroglyphics in 1822 changed everything. Suddenly, the inscriptions covering Egyptian temples could be read. The poem of Ptah and the bulletin text became accessible to modern scholars. Egyptologists realized they were looking at detailed accounts of a massive battle between Egypt and some enemy called Hatti, though nobody was quite sure who the Hittites were. The early translations presented Kadesh as unambiguous Egyptian victory. Why wouldn't they? The Egyptian sources were triumphant. Ramesses' propaganda was completely persuasive, and there were no contrary sources available. For decades, historians believed the Battle of Kadesh represented Egypt's greatest military triumph, that Rameses had personally slaughtered thousands of enemies through a combination of skill and divine favor, that the Hittites had been decisively defeated. Then, in 1906, the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler began excavating at Boğazkale in central Turkey. The site was known to be ancient, possibly important, but nobody expected what Winkler found: Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, with its archives intact, thousands of clay tablets preserved in the fire that destroyed the city, written in Akkadian and Hittite cuneiform, containing diplomatic correspondence, treaties and administrative records from a superpower that had ruled Anatolia and Syria while Egypt commanded the Nile. And among those tablets were references to Kadesh, terse military reports, administrative documents, treaties referencing the battle, and, most dramatically, the Hittite copy of the peace treaty between Rameses and Hattusili III. The treaty that proved Egypt and Hatti had made peace as equals, which meant Ramesses' claims of decisive victory were exaggerated. The discovery forced a complete reassessment. Historians realized they'd been reading propaganda as history. The Hittites hadn't been crushed at Kadesh. They'd held the city, maintained their Syrian territories, and eventually negotiated peace from a position strong enough to demand equal terms. The battle that Egyptian sources described as triumph was actually, at best, a costly stalemate. This created scholarly controversy that continues today. How much of the Egyptian account is true? Did Rameses really fight surrounded by enemies, or was that dramatic embellishment? Were the Naarin a planned relief force or lucky reinforcements? Did the Hittites really lose senior commanders, or were those kills invented for propaganda purposes? We have sources from both sides now, but they're telling different stories for different audiences, and separating fact from spin remains difficult. Modern archaeology has added physical evidence. Excavations at Kadesh itself, the modern site of Tel Nebi Mend in Syria, have revealed the city's fortifications, confirmed its strategic importance, and provided some evidence of late Bronze Age destruction layers that might correspond to the battle period. But battlefield archaeology is difficult, especially for Bronze Age warfare, and we'll probably never find definitive physical proof of specific events from May 12, 1274 BCE. What we can say is this: Kadesh represents one of the first battles in human history where we have detailed accounts from both sides, extensive visual documentation, diplomatic follow-up records, and enough evidence to reconstruct not just what happened, but why both sides described it the way they did. It's a case study in how propaganda works, how military history gets written by victors, or by survivors who claim to be victors, and how truth becomes obscured by the stories people need to tell themselves. Military historians study Kadesh for insights into Bronze Age warfare, chariot tactics, division organization, the role of intelligence and counterintelligence, the importance of logistics and communications. It's taught in staff colleges as an example of what happens when commanders outrun their support, when intelligence failures lead to tactical surprise, when propaganda obscures strategic reality. Diplomacy scholars study the Treaty of Kadesh as humanity's first fully documented peace treaty. The mechanisms it established, mutual defense, extradition agreements, divine enforcement, amnesty provisions, appear in modified forms in international law today. The treaty demonstrated that even the bitterest enemies could make lasting peace if both sides recognized that continued conflict served neither's interests. But perhaps the most profound legacy is philosophical. Kadesh teaches us that victory is often a matter of perspective. By any objective measure, the battle was at best a draw. Egypt failed to take Kadesh, but survived a near-catastrophic defeat. Both sides claimed victory. Both had arguments. Both were partially right and partially engaged in self-deception. The truth of what happened depends on which questions you're asking and which outcomes you're measuring. Rameses wanted military glory and built his entire reign around claiming it. He got his wish. He's remembered as Rameses the Great, and Kadesh is central to that reputation. But the greatest achievement of his reign wasn't the battle propaganda. It was the peace treaty that followed, which barely gets mentioned in popular histories of ancient Egypt. We remember the exciting lie more than the important truth. The battle also reminds us how fragile historical memory is. For 3,000 years, one of the ancient world's most important battles was completely forgotten, its very occurrence unknown to history. Only the accident of archaeological discovery, Napoleon's invasion leading to hieroglyphic decipherment, Winkler stumbling across Hattusa, brought it back to human knowledge. How many other pivotal events have vanished completely, their stories lost because the records didn't survive or haven't been found yet? Today, you can visit the sites where the battle unfolded. The ruins of Kadesh sit in war-torn Syria, largely inaccessible to tourists and archaeologists because of ongoing conflict. A bitter irony for a city that symbolized ancient warfare. Abu Simbel, rescued from flooding by a UNESCO project that cut the entire temple free and moved it to higher ground, still displays Ramesses' battle reliefs to modern visitors. Karnak and Luxor, preserved by Egypt's dry climate, allow tourists to trace the battle's progression across hundreds of feet of stone walls. The battle reliefs have themselves become historical documents, not just for what they depict, but for what they reveal about how ancient societies constructed memory and meaning from warfare. Every tour group that sees them receives a compressed version of Ramesses' propaganda, the heroic Pharaoh, the miraculous deliverance, the triumphant victory. The lies carved in stone still work 3 millennia later, still shape how we understand the ancient world, still demonstrate that controlling the narrative can be more powerful than controlling the battlefield. And somewhere in the ruins and dust of northern Syria, the actual ground where Redivision was ambushed, where Rameses fought surrounded, where thousands died on a spring day in 1274 BCE, remains largely unexamined. The sands hold evidence we haven't found yet. Arrowheads, chariot fittings, human remains, the physical residue of history's first fully recorded battle. Someday, if peace ever comes to that region, archaeologists might excavate and find artifacts that finally answer questions that 3,000 years of texts and propaganda haven't resolved. Until then, The Battle of Kadesh remains what it's always been, a story about the gap between what happened and what we're told happened, about how warriors and propagandists fight different kinds of battles, about how the long arc of history sometimes vindicates actions that seemed like failures at the time. Rameses fought to a draw and called it victory. Muwatalli won tactically and called it victory. Both were wrong, both were right, and both created a peace that mattered more than any battle could. That's the real lesson of Kadesh. Though it's not the one carved on temple walls, sometimes the greatest triumph is knowing when to stop fighting and start negotiating. The echoes continue. Every time nations transition from war to peace, every time propaganda obscures military reality, every time archaeological evidence contradicts official histories, the Battle of Kadesh resonates. Not because it was the most important battle in history, it probably wasn't, but because it's one of the first battles we can actually study from multiple perspectives, with enough evidence to see through the propaganda to something approximating truth. 3,300 years later, we're still learning from what happened on the banks of the Orontes River. Still debating what Rameses' survival means, whether divine intervention is metaphor or belief, how empires learn to coexist, why peace often requires both sides to claim victory. The battle ended in an afternoon. The conversation continues forever. That might be the most fitting legacy for history's first recorded battle. It taught us that recording history is just the beginning. Understanding it requires looking behind the records, questioning the recorders, and accepting that truth is often more complex and more interesting than the stories we tell ourselves about glory and defeat. Rameses wanted to be remembered as the greatest pharaoh who ever lived. He succeeded, but not necessarily for the reasons he intended. We remember him not just because he built monuments and won battles, but because his propaganda was so successful that we're still unpacking it 3 millennia later, still marveling at how effectively one man shaped history by controlling how history remembered him. The walls remember. But we're finally learning to read them critically, to see both what they say and what they're trying to hide. That's the final victory. Not Ramesses', not Muwatalli's, but ours, the victory of historical understanding over ancient propaganda, of nuanced truth over simplistic mythology. The Battle of Kadesh may not have changed the ancient world as much as both sides hoped, but it changed how we understand the ancient world, and that might matter more in the long run. The chariots are dust, the warriors are bones, the empires are ruins. But the story, complicated, contradictory, endlessly fascinating, lives on. That's the real immortality Rameses achieved. Not divine glory, but human curiosity about what really happened when 2 Bronze Age superpowers clashed on a Syrian battlefield, and both walked away, claiming they'd won. The question echoes across 33 centuries, and the answer keeps changing as we find new evidence and ask better questions. The walls remember, and we're still learning to listen.